Hello, welcome to another series of a deep dive on Facebook Live with Rooted in Language. We are very, very excited to be able to do this. Rita recently finished up doing a deep dive series with the book Crispin, which was really great, kind of a 4-part, really digging into that book, giving you a lot of great information about that. And I will be doing something similar, but with a different book. So the book I am going to be spending the next this and 3 more sessions talking about is The Thief Lord by Cornelia Funke. And I'm not sure if that is actually how you pronounce her last name. I've never known how to pronounce her last name. That's probably something I should look up or find her saying her own last name. I don't know. So yeah, I always thought it was Funky or Funke or Funk, something like that, but it's by her, by Cornelia. This is a wonderful book. It's one of my favorites. It's one of Rita's favorites, Maura's favorites. It's just a Rooted in Language, all around fantastic story. So we decided it was a good one to really dive into. It is a young adult book. And I tend to think about it as kind of a middle school, maybe even into high school read, a little bit older than Crispin that Rita went through, because it is just a little bit of a higher reading level, and it deals with more complex themes, possibly, arguably, although there are complex themes in Crispin too, but it does deal with some more, just more. You have to be a little older to understand some of what it's talking about, some of the more complex aspects of the story, which we're going to get into. So that's why it might be a little bit of an older reading level. So yeah, somewhere in that kind of middle school to high school range. So I'm going to dive into the beginning portion of the book. But before I do, as a fair warning, this session, all of these deep dives about this will be full of spoilers. This book is kind of spoiler heavy because there's a lot of kind of twists and turns and unexpected things and kind of surprises and things to it that are a little different, a little maybe not what you were expecting them to be. So if you were planning on reading the book and don't want anything spoiled, I'm sorry, I'm going to be talking very openly about things that happen in it. But I will also be talking a little bit about one of the benefits of knowing some of that stuff before they actually happen in the story. But that is one of the cool things about it, is there are unexpected moments, and watching your student or watching your child read those and uncover these kind of mystery moments in it is really neat. And they're very unexpected, and kids get really into it and really involved in the emotion of the story and just in the whole kind of swirl of it. And it's really neat. So a fair warning, spoilers are coming, big spoilers are coming, but it should all be good. So one of the benefits of knowing a story, particularly one that has twists in it, one of the benefits of knowing that when your student might not know is you can help direct them and help them pay attention to certain things that they might otherwise miss. Little like flags and little key things that are like clues almost. It's not a mystery, but it has sort of an aspect to it where you're like, I see some hints that then lead me to understand something more about the story. So that is one of the big benefits of knowing it beforehand. Can really help you be able to help your student in a way that they can understand it much more. So that's one of the big kind of pre-notes. So all of that being said, I am going to jump into kind of the opening of the story. Part 1 today, I'm going to talk about the first kind of quarter of the book. It's roughly like chapters 1 through 15. And I think there are 50 some odd, maybe 53 chapters in the book total. But this first quarter, I call the introduction, because that's a lot of what's happening at the very beginning of the book, particularly in the first 5 chapters or so, is that a lot of characters are being introduced, which is pretty typical at the beginning of a book. But in the case of The Thief Lord, there are a lot of characters to be introduced. This has a pretty large ensemble cast, and as readers, we have to keep track of all of those people. And sometimes that can be really difficult, especially if there are similarities between different characters and you're like, wait a minute, I don't see a big difference between these 2 people, and I've kind of just made them the same character. Or if names are complicated, sometimes that can make us kind of mix characters together because we're not fully reading the name. Both of which might actually come up in this story. So overall, the book takes place in Venice, in Italy. And while the whole thing is in English, there are a lot of Italian words that come up, and some of the names have Italian origin. It's a really good opportunity to talk about maybe some phonetics of Italian. And I think most copies, at least the copy that I have, I don't know if this is, I think it's true of all of them, have in the back a section of the words in Italian and what they mean in English. So it can be a cool thing to kind of talk about this difference when you come across these words where it's like, we have the word like vaporetto, and what does that mean in English? And we have a piazza or a palazzo instead of a, let's say a piazza would be like a square, right? Like a town square. So it can really help understand the story by going through some of those individual words. So a lot of that is introduction information for you. But one of the first things that I wanted to talk about in the book, and this is one of the things I talk about with my students a lot, is the opening paragraph. So I have it in front of me. I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to talk about it. So the opening paragraph says, "It was autumn in Venice when Victor first heard of Prosper and Beau. The canals, gleaming in the sun, dappled the ancient brickwork with gold. But the wind was blowing ice-cold air from the sea, reminding the Venetians that winter was approaching. Even the air in the alleyways tasted of snow, and only the wings of the carved angels and dragons high up on the rooftops felt any real warmth from the pale sun." So right away, with this introductory paragraph, we have this beautiful kind of painting that is created. And this scene of autumn and winter coming into Venice. I love the opening paragraphs of books, of any book I do. I love to spend time on the opening line and the opening paragraph because it's our first entry point into a book, right? In terms of reading it. We do get the title, and we can talk about information from the cover. And I think Rita talked a little bit about kind of cover clues that we can get that tell us something about the story. But the opening paragraph is kind of that door that gets opened, and we get to set foot, our first step into the world of this story. And it tells us a lot, especially coming from a perspective of knowing the whole story and looking back at this opening paragraph. But right off the bat, we are introduced to 3 different names. If you caught that in the first line, we're introduced to Victor, Prosper, and Beau. So even in the first line, it's like, whoop, there's going to be several characters we have to keep track of. We don't know anything about them yet, but we know that we have to keep our eyes open, keep our minds kind of tuned to those people. We're also introduced to the city of Venice. We're told immediately where it takes place, and we're given kind of some clues about Venice. And this is a great thing if your student is unfamiliar with Venice, to actually take time even before reading it, going over what's important about Venice. Well, it's a city built on the water, and they don't have streets, they have canals. And what is a canal? And what are gondolas, and kind of some of the background knowledge, background information that helps enrich this text. And then we're also introduced to the time of year and kind of the weather at the very beginning here. We're told that it's autumn, but not just autumn, that there is ice cold wind blowing in, right? So it tells us that winter is on the way. Cold weather, you know, even ice cold is kind of almost threatening, right? Weather that's coming in. And it's reminding the Venetians that winter is coming, right? That you can't get away from it. It is on its way. So we have characters, we have a location, and we have weather, all expressed in the very opening of this book. And then the fourth thing that's a little more subtle at the very beginning has to do with the wings of the carved angels and dragons, that line. And again, if you look up pictures of Venice, if you're familiar with Venice, you know the architecture, perhaps. We know that there are all these, you know, giant statues and carvings and all kinds of ancient things in the brick and stone. But it has almost a magical quality to it. Almost kind of this, you know, so ancient we're not sure how to describe it, or something beyond what we're used to. Unless you live in Venice, and then you might be used to it. But because they're winged things, they're dragons, they're angels, these are things that are beyond your normal everyday existence. And so it almost elevates it to this level of something vaguely magical. There's nothing else that's outright magical expressed in that kind of opening paragraph or the rest of that chapter, but we get this just tiny hint, right? And again, something to kind of keep in the back of your mind as you're reading, something to be aware of, that there's this underlying, maybe undercurrent of something magical going on. So an important thing to pay attention to. So as going through the first chapter and the first couple chapters, one of the things I like to do in order to keep track of a lot of characters is to build a character web. And that term is very broad. That could look a lot of different ways. And anytime I do a character web with students, it ends up looking different because it's different based on the story you're in, and it's different based on whoever you're working with. I like to let the student kind of help control what the web looks like. The important things that I make sure are on it is that there's a space for each character with their name. And there's a space to describe a little bit about that character, some personality traits, behaviors, some whatever information we have about them. And that there's space to show how characters are connected to each other. So my character web is very appropriately called a web for this book in particular, because there are a lot of characters and they all intermingle and interact and get kind of tangled together. So this will end up being messy. And honestly, for this, that's completely fine. You know, I do talk about with my students that writing and creating is a messy process, and understanding is a messy process. So it is important to kind of keep that in mind, that, you know, we will get stuff all mixed around and we might have to change it in the middle of working on it, and that's totally fine. Hang on, I lost my video for myself to keep track of stuff. Okay, so one of the first characters we meet is Victor. And throughout the first chapter, we learn a little bit about him. We learn that he is a detective, which is important to know. We learn that he's, maybe I'm going to zoom in a little bit because that's, there we go. That he loves disguises. We learn that pretty early on. He's a little clumsy. He's a little goofy. He's kind of got a little bit of kind of silliness to him. I'm going to add clumsy. And as we go through these first couple chapters, and I'm going to show you a couple different quotes. I don't have, don't have a ton for it, but, or I'm not going to go through a ton for it, sorry. There are a lot of really great quotes from this, but I'm not going to pull every single one. But we learn about the people who hired him, the Hartlibs. And specifically, we learn about Esther, who is the aunt of the main character that we are looking for. And we learn that, honestly, she's kind of mean. She doesn't like to smile. So we learn about both of these characters, and we also learn about their relationship with each other. And this is something that I like to include in my character webs, is that they have a very specific relationship, and it's a business relationship that Esther hired Victor. And I like to keep track of this, and this is where stuff can get really messy because we end up with a lot of different relationships going on. Because as we're going and we meet Victor, we meet Esther, we eventually meet in chapter 2 our kind of big characters. We meet those 2 other names that were mentioned in the opening paragraph. We meet Prosper and we meet Beau. And I'm going to read, I'm going to put, actually, I'm debating here. I'm going to read just a quote here about in chapter 2, when we kind of first meet Prosper, and we learn that he is a young boy, he's in his early teens, and Beau is his younger brother, who is about 5, I think 5 or 6. So in meeting Prosper, we learn that that their parents have died and that they have run away from their aunt Esther. So we learn another couple of relationships. We learn that they are brothers. I didn't leave myself enough room. There we go. And we learn that she is their aunt and that they ran away. Right, so already in the, even just these first 2 chapters, we get a sense of how complex, right? We're building a lot of kind of very realistic people here and a lot of real relationships that happen. So we know that Prosper and Beau are both orphaned and are run away to Venice and are striking it out on their own and trying to make a life on their own. And this paragraph from chapter 2 about Prosper says, since they had begun to fend for themselves, Prosper had learned how to steal. Only food at first, but then money too. He hated it. He always got scared and his fingers started to tremble every time. Beau, however, thought it was an exciting game. Prosper had forbidden his brother to steal anything, and he told him off very harshly every time he caught him. He certainly didn't want to give Esther a chance to say that he had turned his little brother into a thief. So we learn more about Prosper in that he has had to steal, but he hates it. Right? Had to steal, but hates it. And this is really an important note about him because we get a battle, an internal battle for our character here about what he has to do versus what he wants to do, right? And what he thinks is right and thinks is wrong, and kind of where he lands on that line between these things. Versus his brother, who is younger and wants to have fun. He thinks that stealing is a game, right? He's kind of a silly, goofy, bouncy little kid. Right? He is even described as bouncing quite a bit, right? He's just there to have fun. He doesn't see the danger or the risk in the way that Prosper does. So we can start to see how complex each individual character is and how complex their relationships are, even from a really early point, right? Even by like second and third chapter, that we know a handful of these characters, but the entire story is built around them. Which brings up the point that this book you can study in a variety of ways, right? We could look at it following the plot arc, like we might using annotating literary elements. And you can follow plot points and find, the climax and the crisis and all of these pieces. They're definitely there. You could also follow it using the hero's journey that Rita talked about in her in the Crispin deep dive, and we had a previous Facebook Live about, because it does follow a journey. But primarily, this story deals with character. It is a character-driven book. That is the primary focus of it. That's why even by the third chapter, you have a complex web of characters, and you haven't even gotten everybody on there yet. It's why everyone feels real, feels like an actual person you might meet or have a relationship with, right? Because it's completely character driven, which makes it really cool. And I think can really help with some students being able to identify with character, which can be tricky. Identifying with the people we're reading about is a skill all by itself, right? Being able to kind of put ourselves in the shoes of our characters to understand why they're making the decisions that they're making. But having more complex characters, having people who are making what feel like real life decisions can lead to really good conversation around what that actually means, right? If you were Prosper, if you were forced to steal in order to survive, well, first of all, would you, right? We get this question of kind of morality and right versus wrong. And even if we don't believe in stealing, if we think that stealing is wrong, and yet we meet this character who we like, he's a very likable person who is doing something wrong, but in the name of surviving, in the name of saving his brother, in the name of, having freedom and not having to live with their terrible tyrannical aunt who, doesn't like Prosper. So we get this interesting kind of play, and then that is a breeding ground of good conversation, even at the second and third chapter point, right? We're not very far in this book at all, and yet it has opened itself up for really, really rich conversation as you get to know these characters and their complexities more deeply. So morality is one of those big themes that comes up throughout the whole story. Again, that's one of the benefits of knowing the story. We can know these big themes or big ideas, and we can start to kind of help our students by pointing out, like, I know that morality, internally, I know morality is something that gets kind of debated in the minds of some of these characters. So why don't we talk about it too, right? One of the other things that goes along with morality and goes along with Prosper in particular, and other characters, is an idea of kind of duality or duplicity, that we get multiple sides to things. This is true of people in real life, right? This is why these characters feel real, is they are multi-sided. They don't just behave in a very clear, straightforward, black and white kind of way. Each of their decisions comes from a complex place because they are complex people. And another kind of big idea to be looking out for, and a big idea to be helping your students find examples of that, here's an example of Prosper not knowing what to do and feeling torn about what he's doing because there is kind of this multi-sided aspect to everything that he encounters. Okay. So from there, as we move through these first kind of 5 chapters, into chapter 4, we meet the titular character, which is one of my favorite words, meaning it is the reference to the title. We actually meet the thief lord. He is referenced earlier, and we get to see what Beau thinks of him. We get to see what some other characters think of him, but he's actually steps onto the scene in chapter 4, which I do like to talk about with students, that sometimes, when you have the title character, the person who's on the front of the book, doesn't show up in the book until chapter 4. It's not the first person you meet. So it's kind of an interesting, I wonder why, and something to kind of think about. But I'm going to read this, the first scene here when we actually meet Scipio, the thief lord. So it says, Scipio shrugged. He ran his slender fingers through his long raven black hair, which he usually wore in a ponytail. You should know by now that I can get into any place I want to. Scipio, the thief lord. He liked to act grown up, although he was not much older than Prosper, and a good bit smaller than Mosca, even in his high-heeled boots. These were much too big for him, but he always kept them well polished. They were black leather, as black as the strange long coat that reached down to his knees. He never went anywhere without them. Wake the others, Scipio commanded in his bossy, condescending voice, which Hornet hated so much. Prosper ignored him. So I'm going to put this one under the document camera to kind of talk about it a little bit. Oops. Okay. So we meet Scipio, and we have this kind of, this section about him that tells us a lot. We get a lot of information from a relatively small amount of text. We get to see what he looks like a little bit. So he has long raven black hair that he usually wears in a ponytail. And this story is set in a modern time. I'm trying to remember exactly when the book was published, but it's a modern story. So we talk a little bit about, okay, we have this person who has super long hair and he wears back in a ponytail, and perhaps what images that brings to mind. And so he has a very unique look, especially compared to the other characters, that nobody else dresses the way he does. Nobody else, wears the things that he wears. And then his statement, you should know by now that I can get into any place I want to. This feels very like a braggart, right? He brags a lot about it. He's cocky about it. And this, you should know by now, right? He's talking to Prosper. So it's, you know what, keep up. You should know this. This is just a fact about me, right? He's very self-assured in this instance. He's showing off. I think that might have 2 R's. Right, he sees himself as incredibly important, right? That he's skilled. And then we just have this lovely, it's not even, officially a sentence, just the statement, right? Scipio, the thief lord, which feels like an announcement. Right? That we have, you can imagine like somebody, I don't know, in an old ball or something, slamming a big stick on the ground and announcing, right? Scipio, the thief lord. And then he enters. Very, very important, right? We have this heavy importance going on here. Followed immediately by the fact that we are told he acts this way, right? He's not actually a grown-up. He's not much older than Prosper. He's a teenager. He's not very tall. He's smaller than another character. but he wears high-heeled boots to make up for that fact, right? So he acts a certain way, he acts like a grown-up, he wears high-heeled boots, but he's not that old, he's not that big. And so we start to see this kind of difference between the way that he's presenting himself, or the way that he thinks of himself, and what is actually happening, right? What we actually get to see. Again, there's kind of that idea of duality, right? Kind of two sides to this. Two different things, two different ideas being presented. The boots are too big for him, but he polishes them anyway. So again, this is reality. From one perspective, he wears these giant boots that would be kind of clown-like and ridiculous, and yet he treats them as if they are the most important thing on the world, or in the world, right? They're black leather. He has this black long coat. So you start to see this image of this young boy, this teenager, who with his long black hair and his long black coat and his big black boots, is kind of possibly going for being maybe imposing, right? If that's maybe what his goal is, or being noticeable in this sort of unique kind of way. We come back to this. And if that's his goal, you know, is he actually achieving that? Is he actually, you know, in charge? Is he actually as important as what he is trying to be? And we get kind of an answer, and it is a little bit out of context here, so we do have to think about this in the, you know, pulling just a piece out of this whole chapter. But he orders Prosper to wake the others. Going back to this imposing, being maybe in charge. And it's this voice that Hornet hates, another character that we have. Hornet hates this voice, and Prosper ignores him. So we have this whole mess of looking a specific way, announcing himself, showing how, you know, incredible he is. He's an amazing thief. He can sneak in anywhere. He's in charge. He's kind of maybe a little threatening, maybe a little, you know, he's big and powerful. And ultimately, he has a voice that Hornet hates and Prosper ignores. And so we get, again, kind of this back and forth, kind of a duality, a little bit of a argument almost between how he presents himself and what's actually happening. Okay, so he is a really, really good person to have on this character web that we're building. So if we're adding to it as we go, we might add that some of that, those details about Scipio, right? That he tries to be in charge, and he tries to be important, but, you know, maybe he falls short of it sometimes, right? Maybe he gets people who ignore him or don't like his tone. So he doesn't always succeed. But he has this leadership position over Prosper and Bo, and over the couple others that we meet, Hornet and Rikyū and Mosca. Again, a lot of characters that we're keeping track of, but he has this leadership position that he, you know, lays claim to. And for the most part, we see throughout these chapters, it does get paid attention to. They know when he's coming to visit them at the old rundown palace or theater that they live in. And they work to clean everything up because they know he's coming, and nobody knows where he goes at night. And he, you know, sneaks around and steals things and has them sell them off. And so he definitely has this leadership position for a reason. And yet there are moments when it kind of falls through, and we kind of see through some of the show that he puts on, and some of this this importance and sort of fluffing and, you know, awesomeness that he is surrounded in, sometimes kind of gets his balloon popped a little bit, right? When Prosper ignores his commands or Hornet tells him off, and, you know, we get kind of a little bit of almost a power struggle from time to time. So he is, again, interesting to watch for all of those same kind of thematic reasons, some of the morality, some of the duality going on. And then the last character I'm going to talk about in terms of people being introduced is the character of Barbarossa. And I love Barbarossa because I find him a particularly interesting and kind of funny character. But he is another adult, and this is where we start to see a little bit of a difference in the book between a group of children, a group of orphans who all live together in this rundown abandoned theater. So we have kind of the children together, and then we have adults kind of over on the other side. And we've met Victor, we've met Esther, two very different people. Victor is kindly and a little clumsy, but a detective. He's determined, he's got a job to do. Esther's least favorite activity is smiling, right? She's very different. She's determined to get Beau back, to get Prosper. She's aggressive. She's a little harsh or a lot harsh, but still they're together on the adult side of things. So we've really drawn a line between the children and the adults. And then we meet Barbarossa, who is another person to add to the adult side of things. He is connected to the children because after the thief lord, after Scipio steals goods, he sends some of the gang to sell the goods to Barbarossa. And Barbarossa runs a pawn shop and buys the goods from the kids at a really low price, and then turns around and sells them to tourists at a 3 and 4 times as much marked up price. So I'm gonna read you just a little piece here. I hope you brought some decent goods this time, the man murmured disdainfully, but the boys noticed how he stared at the bag in Prosper's hands, like a hungry cat eyeing up a fat, juicy mouse. So we get to see that Barbarossa, we have a little bit of description earlier in this chapter, in the 5th chapter, that he marks up the goods that he buys from them, that he shows disdain for these kids coming in and trying to sell him stuff, that he likes to take advantage of anybody, but especially of these kids. And yet he's eyeing things up, right? Like a hungry cat. He's always calculating, always trying to find the right angle, always trying to get in things. He's greedy. He's very selfish. The only thing that matters to him is that, you know, he's making enough money and that his shop is running and he can continue to do what he wants to do. He has no real concern for anyone else. So we get to meet this other adult, and we put him on this side, and we get to see, or start to see and start to talk about the difference between childhood and adulthood, and how children are acting and how they're presented in the book, and how adults act and are presented in the book, which I will get to in actually the next chapter. So after we meet Barbarossa, and the kids have an exchange with him, and Prosper actually flexes his haggling muscles, and he does a really good job of being able to prevent Barbarossa from taking advantage of him. We learn a little bit more about that Prosper has this ability to haggle and kind of this stone-faced, almost steely side to him. And in the next chapter, we see that Prosper and another character, Riccio, have this conversation about being children. and we get to see their kind of feelings about it. Prosper feels very small and ineffective as a child. His main goal is to protect Bo and to keep his aunt from getting into their lives and to keep Bo safe and happy. And he realizes that it's very, very difficult to do as a kid, and that if he were an adult, it would be much simpler, right? That you can just sort of, according to the adults around him, you can do what you want. You can have control of your world. And Rikyo is a little bit younger and goofy and is always hungry and, you know, wants to play much like Bo, and thinks that's silly, right? That being a child is so much more fun, right? You can avoid being seen, you can hide in places. When you eat, you get full really quickly. And he loves being young. And so we have this little bit of a comparison, and we see, or Rikyo tells us Shipio's opinion of being an adult versus a child. So again, the thief lord who does all this posturing and acts grown up also, unsurprisingly, has an opinion about being a child. And we can actually start, this is a great little kind of bits and pieces of writing for each character, starting to track their opinion about being a child or being an adult. So in the case of Prosper, he's kind of in this, we're not really sure. He understands what would be good about being an adult. Maybe he would rather be an adult. Rikyo loves being a kid. Everything's great. Bo loves being a kid. It's fun. We get to play. We get to do whatever we want. Yay, right? Shipio, we learn more about, but he acts like an adult. He wants to be in charge. We can start to kind of surmise his opinion about being a child, and again, kind of how ineffective and small you can end up being when you're still a kid. So another really big theme to keep in mind as you're going through it, this kind of adulthood versus childhood. Okay, I'm going to kind of move through the next couple chapters a little faster because this is a big book. It's thick. It's full of, not big because it's super, super long, but big because it's big ideas. And it is one that is worthwhile going through slowly and really chewing on it because there are great lines, there are great moments, wonderful conversations in the story that can lead to really rich conversations about the story and outside of it. You know, again, even having a little bits and pieces of writing with your own student where it's like, would you rather be a child or an adult? Do you have an opinion about that, right? You know, what do you think is good about being a kid versus what's good about being an adult? And, you know, do you agree with Rikyo or Prosper? Do you agree with Shipio? Do you agree with Bo? Would you rather just, you know, run around and play and have kittens and eat cake? I'd rather do that, honestly, but I don't get to choose, I suppose. As we're going along, the gang is given this opportunity to take a thieving job, a theft, that Barbarossa connects them with. He says he has a client who is looking to hire the thief lord to do a special job. And as we're moving through, we learn a little bit more. We learn about this person known as the Conte, or the Count. So there's another lovely Italian word, the Conte, who is kind of a man of mystery. We don't know very much about him at this point. And he has this job that he wants the thief lord to do. He has an item that he wants the thief lord to steal for him. And there's a bit of debate about whether or not the gang should actually agree to do this theft. Which leads up to Shipio ultimately decides that he wants to do it. He is the thief lord. He's gonna do the job. He's been hired. It's another kind of big posturing moment for him where Hornet is calling him out saying, you're just a kid, just like the rest of us. You know, if Barbarossa, if the Conte found out that you're you know, as young as you are, they would never hire you. And Scipio sees that as a moment to kind of stand up for himself and say, you know what? Nope, this is who I am. This is what I do. I don't back down. I'm going to take the job. And again, as someone who knows the story and kind of even, you know, if you're familiar with this sort of the unraveling path of literature, this is kind of an oncoming train moment where this is a big deal that they've been hired by this outside person. They're not just stealing little tiny trinkets or little bits and bobs to sell to Barbarossa. This is now someone outside, a third party, who is coming into their area and wants to pay them for some big theft. There's a lot of uncertainty and mystery wrapped around it, and therefore a lot of risk and a lot of danger, right? These two things go together in general, but also in literature a lot. That when we have uncertainty, when we don't know what, not even just not knowing what the outcome, but not seeing the path, not knowing what's going to happen at all, the risk goes way up. And the risk for these kids is very real, because we have Victor the detective looking for Prosper and Beau. We have Esther, who's, you know, determined and is paying Victor for that. We have this sort of hidden group who doesn't want to be caught by the police in general, right? Let alone specific kind of antagonist characters. So our risk factor is just escalating as this goes. And as soon as Scipio accepts the job and decides that he's going to meet with this Conte, we know it's kind of this moment of, we have no idea where we're going now, right? We've crossed the line into, to go back to kind of the hero's journey, we've crossed this threshold into the unknown. We have entered a space of danger and challenge. And so they end up meeting with the Conte in a confessional in a big church. And they can't quite see each other. Each one is as mysterious as the other. Scipio, as the thief lord, wears this big Venetian bird mask, which, now that I'm remembering, I actually meant to grab. I have one, so maybe I'll have that for next week. But he wears this disguise, which he normally wears along with his coat and his boots. And we don't get to really see the Conte very clearly. Each one is a title, not a name, right? The thief lord versus the Conte, not knowing the other's name. And he gives this mysterious box to them that has information about what they're going to steal and a way to contact him. And he doesn't go into detail about what it is, but he tells them that it's in a house and more details will be in the box when he's gone. So again, we've increased the risk. Every moment of this is just elevating the danger and the kind of intrigue that goes along with it. Simultaneously, we have a division in our group of characters. We have some of the gang gets left outside of the church. They're not allowed to come with them, including Beau. And some of the gang goes in the church. We have the Conte who's providing the information. And we have Victor who's waiting out in the piazza, out in the square, looking for Prosper and Beau. So we have kind of the same scene from multiple angles. And each one is as intriguing as the other. And this is a great opportunity for bits and pieces of writing. Anytime you have this kind of single scene from multiple points, we can enter each perspective. And it's great to do little pieces of writing about almost like a diary entry from the perspective of that character. So we read the scene where they meet with the Conte. Well, let's write that scene from the Conte's perspective, right? Or write maybe his feelings about it. What does he think of the thief lord? What does he think of, you know, giving this job to an obviously very young person? We can flip the coin and write it from Scipio's perspective, from the thief lord's perspective. What does he think about receiving this job and maybe people who doubted him, or, you know, what's going to happen? jump to a perspective of one of the kids who was left out, including like Hornet, who's very angry about being left out of the meeting and what she's thinking about the whole time. Even jumping to Victor's perspective, that he kind of sees some of this from afar and what his plans are and what he's thinking about. So really good little moments, and even picking, you know, one or two good opposite ones are nice. So even, you know, Scipio versus Hornet are kind of opposites. The Conte and Scipio are opposites. And bouncing back and forth between those, or doing a little bit of writing from one perspective, a little bit of writing from another perspective, is a great way to really dive into a complicated scene that is full of a lot of things. And that is roughly where I'm going to end with part one. Today I've been kind of at this for a while. I know there's a lot of stuff with this. But kind of wrapping up from chapter 12, and chapters 13, 14, and 15 kind of carry that scene a little bit further. And again, risk escalates, it continues to. We continue to learn more about our characters. They continue to become more complex. And that section kind of ends with this question of safety. That up until then, up until this meeting with the Conte, and Prosper and Bo and the gang have been relatively safe. Yes, they're stealing. Yes, that's dangerous, but there hasn't been a ton of risk until they have a meeting with the Conte and they actually run into Victor and have a whole run-in with him across chapter 14 and 15. And you know, their disguises are seen through, and they have to get away from him. And so suddenly this place that seemed safe and like a new home now has a lot of danger involved and kind of woven into it, which is a really good conversation about, you know, is the gang safe? You know, will they continue to stay safe? Were they ever safe? Kind of a fair question, a little more complex question. You know, will Victor catch them? What's Victor going to do? And, you know, what's the Conte got to do with all of this? And how does he increase the amount of danger just by suddenly being present, and his whole job that he's given to the Thief Lord? So a really good area to have those kinds of conversations as you're going through each new chapter, each new section. Really enhances the understanding of this story, and can really help get kids really involved in it, because it starts to pick up rather intensely right around there. So that ends part one of Deep Dive with the Thief Lord. Sorry. This is just a personal note. I always misspell the word thief. I don't know why. It's one of those. And so reading this book has also helped me stop misspelling that word, because I write it so often. So, you know, a good moment there, do a little spelling practice just with the word thief is very, very helpful. So a side note, but very, very good, useful side note. So I hope you've enjoyed part one. Welcome to part two of our deep dive Facebook series for the book, The Thief Lord. So last week I did part one of this series. This will be 4 parts in total. Part one dealt with the first quarter of the book, talked a lot about meeting characters, understanding complexity of characters, because The Thief Lord is a very character-driven story. That is the primary focus of the way that I am currently kind of teaching you through this book, is from a perspective of character. As I said last week, there are many, many ways to analyze text, and many ways to analyze this text. We can look at it from a variety of perspectives, but kind of had to pick one, at least for this. So going from a perspective of character, very, very excited to be diving into part two. So sit back, relax, put on your Venetian masks. I've got mine with me here. It's a little weird with my glasses on, but ready to go. Super. I won't have it on the whole time, I promise. Okay. Part 2 that I'm going to be covering deals with chapters 16 through 30. So kind of this middle portion. I haven't quite divided the book perfectly into quarters, done it more based on content, but in general, kind of these quarters. I'm not going to cover things from every single chapter as I go through this because this book is thick. There's a lot going on. It's not an especially like super long story, but it's not tiny either. And there's a lot happening though, right? Every page has something on it. Every chapter is rich. There's a lot of content to sift through. So I've had to pick and choose kind of what to talk about, which is actually something I'm going to be talking about today, is kind of this picking and choosing aspect. So part 2, this chapter 16 through 30, roughly, I kind of dubbed the revelation, which is the name of this section, that at least the name I've given it, because in the first part, which was the introduction, we're introduced to a lot of characters. We learn about the setting, we learn about the world and the people populating that world, and we get to know them pretty well. However, and I gave a big spoiler alert last week, so this is a big spoiler alert for this week. We get a lot of things revealed about our characters, about a lot of different characters, and one character in particular. And it's like the curtain gets drawn back. So we have this big revelation moment, this big aha, oh my gosh, things are totally different. Did not see that coming, right? Maybe we had some hints for it before, but now we're suddenly understanding our characters much more deeply. And suddenly things start to make sense in a way that maybe we were questioning before. So hence the revelation. And of course, whenever we get things revealed about characters, this leads to turmoil. We get internal and external turmoil. We get kind of dissonance going on when characters thought they knew each other and then suddenly realize that maybe they don't. This leads to a lot of conflict and a lot of kind of character versus character conflict going on. And then a lot of internal conflict. So some of our characters, Prosper in particular, our main character, sort of dealing with understanding something about the world, understanding something about his own life, his relationships, the people around him, the people he loves and trusts. Suddenly things are changing, and it leads to a lot of that internal conflict, a lot of struggle within himself, which I'm going to deal a little bit or dive into a little bit more today. A note, kind of a continuation from last week. Last week we started, or I had talked about starting that character web, and had talked about the fact that it can be very messy because lots of characters have been introduced when you've gotten to this kind of chapter 16, 17, 18 point. Your character web will have more on it than what I have here. You will have, lots, if you're tracking everyone, you'll have lots of people and lots of information about those people. And like I said, it will continue to get messier. And that's perfectly fine. Again, I talk a lot with my students about how messy the writing process is and how messy the thinking process and the understanding process is. And that's kind of a perfect visualization of the messiness of our brains and how things are interconnected. And this will make it messier. This series of chapters, we get a couple more people, we learn more about the people we already know. Relationships shift and change a little bit. And so we get more arrows, more chaos to our web. So sometimes if it gets so messy, I even tell students, well, we might start again, right? Clean sheet of paper, we might create a nicer, more organized web, or we're gonna keep the craziness that we have going on, because honestly, that's kind of how it feels at this point in the story. We as readers are feeling a little bit of the chaos that the characters are feeling, a lot of identifying with those people because they feel so real. So chaos in the book, chaos as readers and chaos on the page. It all kind of gets wrapped around. As long as there's understanding going on, kind of thriving in that chaos is totally fine. So definitely, I'm not going to go into the character web again today, but something to continue building throughout the whole book as you're reading it. Another thing to keep track of, and I will reference this a little bit later too, is some of those big themes, those big ideas that I talked about last week. Specifically, we talked about the idea of duality, of this two-sidedness, which is definitely going to come up today. That people are multi-sided, people are complex. They may present one thing and have something else, right? They're multifaceted. They're not as they seem, maybe. And people aren't always simple or straightforward. Kind of keeping that in the back of your mind as an ongoing big idea, an ongoing theme throughout the story. We also have the ongoing battle with morality. And kind of this question of morality, this right versus wrong. And Prosper, we dealt with it early on in the story about whether stealing is good or bad, because he knows that stealing is wrong, but he has to do it in order to survive, and wrestling with that internally. And then we're going to be layering a little bit more on this question of good versus evil, and kind of from a moral standpoint, kind of this right versus wrong idea. So those two themes to be kind of holding on to, looking for, hunting as you're reading this next section. Last note before I dive into specifics is the idea that when text becomes more complex, this is a breeding ground for more discussion, which is then a breeding ground for more writing. We have this kind of chain of events happening, right? We start out understanding the text, gets more complex, we're going to layer in more conversation, which means we get to layer in more bits and pieces of writing as we go. I have some kind of discussion question type things to be thinking about that I'm going to be referencing. But keep in mind, sometimes students don't always respond well to just a direct question, right? Like, what do you think of this? Or, you know, what's your answer to this? Or let's write an answer to this. That isn't always going to be received well. So sometimes opening the door with a conversation, let's talk about what Prosper sees as right versus wrong, right? And then we're going to have a back and forth a conversation. And then from there, maybe write down our thoughts, right? So we can have this kind of chain of events, like I said, where writing can be kind of the culminating part of that conversation. So those are my big ideas before I get into more specifics. Okay. I have to move my mask. Keep things organized. So big time spoiler alert for this. Right in chapter 17, I'm going to read you just a little excerpt from this, or a little passage rather. And this is the moment when Victor, our determined and perhaps a little goofy detective, discovers who Scipio really is, that he is not the charismatic thief, orphan, king of the underworld that he claims he is, but is actually the sort of teenage son of a very, very wealthy man in the city of Venice. So this is right then, this passage. It says, Victor turned around and looked into a pair of frightened black eyes. She's really not well, Dottor Massimo's son murmured. He quickly lowered his head, but Victor had already recognized him. His hair was tied back in a tight little ponytail, and his eyes didn't look quite as arrogant as they had before. But there could be no doubt. This was the boy who had so innocently asked Victor the time, just before he and his friends had tricked him. So we get this section where Victor gets to actually see Scipio in Scipio's home. And there's a similarity in the description of Scipio back to chapter 4 when we first meet him, when he's got his hair, his black hair in a ponytail, and his bright eyes and his defiance and his arrogance. Compared to now, still got his black hair back in a ponytail, but his eyes are not looking as arrogant. He's got his head down. He looks small. He's just a child rather than this sort of king of thieves that he has presented himself as in front of our gang of orphans, right? To Prosper and Bo, they see him one way, and now we see Scipio in this world of the parents, of the adults, of kind of this real world, and everything about how he behaves in that environment. And it's quite a bit different. A little bit of a change up, right? So a really nice comparison moment, a cool thing to talk about with students, as well as this is a great moment of what we call dramatic irony. We as the readers have now learned who Scipio is, who the Thief Lord really is, that he's not who he claims to be. And Victor knows now, but nobody else knows. So dramatic irony is this when we as readers or as an audience know something that the characters don't know. And it creates tension. And maybe a couple of the characters know, but a majority or our main character might not know. And this is tension, not just between characters in the story, but also between kind of the reader and the story. We build this like vibrating space of reading where it's like, you can feel your shoulders kind of raising up and this tension running through you as you're reading, going, oh my gosh, Scipio's not who he claims to be. That's a problem. Victor now knows. That's a problem. Nobody else knows. That's a problem. And we as the reader are kind of the linchpin between all of that information. We're the ones kind of holding it together. And so the further we read, you know, it's like this oncoming train, right? You're forced to watch it happen. So a really good example of that in this story. There are a couple other examples of dramatic irony. Great opportunity to teach on that concept and to talk about this massive issue of Scipio, who has lied about a lot, and what's going to happen from it, right? Kind of this big open-ended question of what are you going to do? What's he going to do? And what's Victor going to do? Again, a good example there of maybe if you just asked your student that, they might not have an answer, but having more of a conversation around it, saying things like, wow, that makes me really nervous because Victor knows. You know, your student might have a response to that. You know, they might be upset about Scipio's lying, and they might have some pretty aggressive feelings about it too. I know a lot of students are very attached to the image of the Thief Lord, and so when they kind of get the rug pulled out from underneath them, it can be very heartbreaking, very much a betrayal that they feel. So good conversation moments for that. Okay. Here. I am going to jump ahead a few chapters because I'm kind of taking this whole piece as kind of this entire chunk of revealing and knowing and learning about characters, and especially more about Scipio. And I have a longer passage. I actually have two passages. We'll kind of see how time goes with these. But with these passages, I want to talk about annotation specifically. I love annotation. I love the concept of annotation. I love the action of annotation. But it is oftentimes a word that can be kind of thrown around and not a lot of definition gets attached to it. I know, I've definitely seen this with students where they're asked to annotate something and they're like, okay, great. What does that mean? What on earth am I actually doing? And at the same time, kind of on the other side of things, we also are always wanting our children to engage with the text they're reading, and like really get into it and really feel something and be kind of steeped in this whole world. And we want to help that happen. Well, those two concepts, annotation over here and wanting kids to be engaged, can completely go together, right? We can achieve one by doing the other. We kind of tie them together. So in simplest terms, annotation is to make note of things. We can kind of hear it, annotation. If you do word study on that word, a great one to do a little word study mini lesson about. The word note is our base word, right? It's right in there. So it is to take note, to make note of things. I tend to define it as kind of thinking on paper. Any thoughts that we have in our head as we're reading, we're going to translate onto the page, which is easier said than done, especially if students are very unfamiliar or very unpracticed with that. It is definitely a skill that you have to practice. Nobody's born magically being able to annotate something. We definitely have to work at it. So with that idea of this kind of thinking on the page, we then go a little bit more specifically. Okay, I'm thinking, I guess, what do I then put on the page? And I'm going to demonstrate with this whole passage here. But basically, I tell my students, as readers, we have to be thinking when we read. That's like part and parcel of the reading process. Your brain is on. It's doing stuff. And it doesn't always seem like it. So we kind of have to prove to ourselves that our brains are working. We have to notice that we're actually thinking, and we have to notice what we're thinking. So I tend to start, my starting point is, if you react to something on the page, make note of it. If you laughed at something somebody said, you're gonna maybe draw ha ha next to it, or write. You could draw a happy face, like you draw a laughing face, or write haha, or this is funny, right? If you're crying over this, intense, tragic moment, well, then you're going to write in the side, I cried here, right? If you are, you turn the page and you read a paragraph and you gasp because this huge reveal happened, then I might write, oh my goodness, or did not see that coming, right? Anytime we react, we mark that reaction. And the more we practice that, the more we realize how much we react to text. It requires very slow reading and slow engagement, very deep, thick engagement with text. But that's kind of that starting point. So we mark things in words, we mark phrases, we might draw pictures, especially if your student loves to draw. I love drawing as kind of side notes. Symbols, arrows, I underline. I write a question if I have a question along the side. I make connections. Anytime I can kind of create what my thought patterns are on the page, that's what I'm doing. This goes back to what I was saying about the character web of it's a little chaotic because our thought processes are often a little chaotic. We bounce between things. We realize and make connections and do this whole spider web of thought. And so the page may get very, very messy, which is why sometimes if I know I'm going to annotate a specific page, I will photocopy it. And I have a copy of what I'm going to be showing so that you can make notes on it without worrying about marking up a book. I tell my students I love marking in my books, but not everybody's okay with that, which I understand. That used to bother me actually a lot when I was a kid. I would get very upset if there was any marking in a text. Really bothered me. Now I have like 14 pens next to any book I'm reading. So we change, but no matter. Okay, I'm going to move this under the document camera and read this and then walk through some of this annotation process. Like I said, this is a pretty big passage and I'm not going to do every single thing on here. But hopefully it'll provide a nice example of everything. So the first thing I'm going to do is just read it. And this is what I have my students do as well, right? We gotta, in order to know what we're thinking, we do just need to read through it. So it says, I'll give you a little context here, sorry, before I read it. The gang is talking to Victor, and he had told them that Scipio was a liar, but they don't know his true identity yet, his true life. And they're regaling Victor with how they met Scipio. So, I stole something off him, Riccio muttered. Okay, I tried to steal something, and he caught me. So I threatened him with my friends, and he let me go on the condition that I took him to meet my gang. Back then, we were living in the basement of an old house, Mosca explained. Riccio, Hornet, and me. It was over in Costello. You can always find a place there. No one wants to live there anymore. It was awful, wet and cold, and we were always ill, and we never had enough to eat. You may as well say it straight. We were in deep trouble, Riccio interrupted him impatiently. You can't live in a rat hole like this, is what Scipio told us. And so he brought us here, to the Star Palace. He picked the lock of the emergency exit and told us to barricade the front entrance. And since then, we've been doing quite well, until you turned up. Okay, I get it, Victor the spoil sport. Victor looked at Prosper. And when Hornet picked up you and Bo, he said to him, the thief lord just fed the two of you as well. Sheep brought us coats and blankets, and he even gave me these. Bo sat down next to Victor and held up one of his kittens. Lost in thought, Victor began to tickle it behind the ears until it started to purr and lick his fingers with its rough tongue. Why did you say Scipio was a liar? Hornet asked. Forget what I said. Victor patted Bo's black hair. Okay. So through this, we have a lot of different things going on. We have a lot of different characters talking, providing thoughts, providing information. And we learn several different things. And I said last week, I'm pretty sure I said this, I'm not sure. Ooh, I don't know. I'll say it again anyway. Whenever we get characters providing opinions of things and kind of character perspectives, it tells us about the character who is providing the information, the one who's actually talking, but it also tells us a little bit about whoever they're talking about. So we get kind of dual information, which happens throughout this. So the first thing we start off with is Riccio talking. So this first little paragraph is Riccio. And he says he stole something off of him. So my thought is that Riccio, we've learned that Scipio isn't who he says he is. But Riccio comes off as trying to steal something. And we know that Riccio likes to steal. We've learned this. He started out stealing. So that's kind of my thought even from this first place, right? Is that Riccio is definitely a thief, right? There's no doubt. I'm sorry, that handwriting, ooh, that was not very clear. I will try to write more clearly. Followed immediately by the statement, okay, I tried to steal something and he caught me. So even though Riccio steals things, he follows it up immediately with this kind of like, all right, well, I didn't actually succeed, right? Which makes me kind of question how good of a thief Riccio is. we haven't seen him steal in the book, or at least not anything that is coming to mind right now. So my thought is, he might not actually be a very good thief. Not a good thief. And Scipio caught him. Now this is a little more kind of a subtlety to this part, but we know that the gang doesn't know about Scipio's other life, his family and his house and his money. So Scipio must have been alone when this happened. This lone boy walking down the street. To to catch someone trying to steal off of him. Because if his parents had been with him, he probably wouldn't have tried to go meet the gang. So it's kind of a little bit more of a, kind of digging into the subtlety, the things that aren't directly said in this. But it is a thought, right? That Scipio must have been alone. And then he tells Riccio that he'll let him go on this condition that he meets the gang. Which makes me question why. Why would he so desperately want to go and meet this group of kids? Which is a fair question, and maybe one that I don't have an answer to. So this is this place where it's okay to not have an answer to it. I do like to think about and maybe try and come up with an answer. But my first thought is, why does he want to meet them so badly? Right? Why would he do that? Why not just turn Riccio in? Why not call the police? Right? Why meet the gang? Right? Why bother with all of that? And from this kind of question, we might be able to then have a conversation, right? Why would Scipio care so much about going to meet the gang? Well, maybe Scipio's lonely. Maybe he wants friends. We've proven that he must have been walking alone here. So maybe it's just because he's so lonely and he meets another kid. Right? This is a possibility, right? A theory, which is something that I do talk to my students about, right? Where that looks like a bee. Lonely. We are allowed to have theories. We're allowed to guess, right? We're kind of scientists when it comes to picking apart this kind of information and identifying this information. We don't have to know the answers. In fact, I kind of do this like we're archaeologists, right? And like, here's your plot of dirt, and we have to dig through and dust off and find the bones. And sometimes you're digging somewhere and there aren't any bones, and you're like, well, that was kind of a crapshoot. Oh, well, I'll go dig somewhere else, right? I was wrong about this idea. I'll go with a different idea. And that is okay. That's part of that chaos of thinking. That's part of that investigation and engagement with our text. Then we get Mosca's paragraph, and he explains that they used to live in this old house in a basement of an old house. It was wet and cold. We were always ill, never had enough to eat. I'm underlining the pieces of this paragraph that are connected. And this is part of things that we can note when we're doing annotation. I've done kind of phrases and sentences and a question over here, but we can also kind of show stuff with like symbols, right? Underlining or circling. And I see a connection between all of these things here. So I have marked them all. And then the thing I want to mark off to the side or write off to the side is that connection. So basement of an old house in Venice, and we might have to remember, if Venice is a city on the water, a basement of an ancient house that is probably submerged in water, right? Well, we know it's wet and cold. He outright says it's wet and cold. But that would be miserable, right? To be stuck in your basement, in the damp, constantly be sick, right? They are not doing well. I might write, I don't know where I have room here, miserable. And they may not have, even to get, a little more dark with it, but, would they be able to survive very long if they continued to live there in the damp, with illness, with not enough food, right? Doesn't seem like the kind of place where you could really survive for very long. And Rikyo comes in and straight up says it, right? He says, you might as well say it straight. We are in deep trouble. Which is kind of an understatement compared to what Moscow was explaining up there and what we maybe concluded that maybe they weren't going to survive. Saying you're in deep trouble when you might not survive feels a little bit to me like an understatement. And then we get this sentence from Scipio. You can't live in a rat hole like this. So this is Scipio's voice, Scipio's opinion. We also now know the kind of place that Scipio lives. He lives in a big old mansion at the top of the hill, right? He probably does not and has never experienced this kind of living. And he takes one look at how Rikyo and Hornet and Mosca are living, and he says, you can't do this anymore. Which I always like to kind of question, like what kind of person, we're starting to kind of build this question of what kind of person is Scipio? And this is a really tough one because, I'm gonna write that question over here. What kind of person is Scipio? This is a tough question for kids to wrap their heads around because Scipio has lied to them. He set himself up as this amazing hero. You know, this is Enrique is even giving us the account of him being a hero, of him maybe saving their lives. But we know that Scipio has lied. And so we get this kind of weird imbalance, and a lot of kids struggle with this, where it's like they don't want to like Scipio because he betrayed them. And yet we see here that he has this kind of hero tendency. He came to save them. He gave them a better place to live. And they're doing well now. Right? They went from miserable, not surviving, to suddenly we are surviving. And not just surviving, we're downright happy. We're excited. We love it here, right? It's amazing. Woohoo! Right? From utter terribleness, I get this frowny face, to super awesomeness because of Scipio. And from the kids' perspectives, from Rikyo and Mosca and Hornet's perspectives, the one who's ruining that right now is Victor, the spoil sport. Right? And I love this line, until you turned up. It sounds so much like Rikyo being just this angry little kid, right? He's like, we were doing well until you showed up, and you can just kind of hear him like pointing at Victor and you know, I don't know, just beyond angry that everything that's gone wrong in the world is Victor's fault somehow, right? And Victor understands that, right? To a certain extent. He sees that his involvement has caused kind of a rift here, right? That has caused a problem. And then Victor looks over to Prosper. So our main character, one of our main characters comes back in here because Victor's starting to tie some different thoughts together, which we'll get to in a second. But me knowing this and having read through all of this already, I can see that Victor's starting to connect some dots. He noticed, he says, when Hornet picks up you and Bo, the Thief Lord just fed the two of you as well. Which makes it sound like it was easy, right? Grab two more people, easy to feed them, no problem. And we come back to this question of the three were living on their own, probably having to steal to fight in order to survive. This is not easy. This life is hard. But as soon as Scipio gets involved, suddenly it becomes easy, which is kind of this moment of like, okay, why? Why would it suddenly be easy? What is it about Scipio that makes this easy? How can he just feed 2 more people? How can he just show up with coats and blankets? And I might even ask that question, right? I'm not even sure how to ask that question. How can Scipio do this so easily, right? Do this so easily, question mark. Ooh, that's really crammed in there. But these things also feed into this question again. He just brought them in off of the street. He fed them. He brought them coats and blankets. He even gives them kittens. He gives Bo kittens to play with, right? Would a betrayer type, would an evil person, would a terrible person do this to people he finds living in a rat hole, as he says? You know, would a bad person take in kids off the street, give them a place to live, give them food and blankets and coats, bring in mattresses, all of that kind of stuff? So we get to, this is right back into the idea of duality. Oops. That Scipio simultaneously has done amazing good for this group. But then we also know that, dramatic irony, and Victor knows that he has betrayed them and lied to them. And these 2 things, totally selfless and totally selfish, existing simultaneously in this person together. Which makes him a very complicated character and makes him difficult for kids to wrap their heads around. And then we come to that very end. I'm going to skip down to here. Hornet remembers what Victor said at the very beginning, that he accused Scipio of being a liar. And Victor's immediate response, he tells her to forget it. Forget that I said that. That's not important. And I like to point out to kids, and again, kind of this question of why. He started out by accusing Scipio. He was all set and ready to tell the kids exactly the kind of person, as in this, that Scipio is. And then he learns that Scipio is actually this. And both at the same time. And it changes Victor's mind. Right? Victor suddenly sees Scipio through their eyes, and he changes his mind about how he's going to behave. Okay. This is why this book is amazing, because this one passage has a ton of stuff in it and a ton of very complex concepts. It takes effort to go through it like this annotating process. I don't do this kind of thing with every passage, right? That would get to be quite a lot going on, right? There's a lot of writing that's happened here. There's a lot of thinking, the chaos of the mind, right? Squished on the page again. It's a lot of energy. It wears me out. I'm worn out now. And I knew all this stuff already. So I'm going to do a smaller version of this again with another passage I have, just a brief one, to give you a little bit more of a demonstration of it. I would not expect this much annotation the first time I sat down and did annotation with a student. No way would I expect this level, right? We got into some really subtle stuff, some really complex stuff down here. I might have a goal in mind. Maybe my goal is to get to this idea. Maybe my goal is that I want my student to see the two sides of Scipio. So as we're annotating, that's pretty much all I'm going to point out to him. Maybe my goal is to show him that why Victor changes his mind. Right? Maybe this thing is my goal. So we're only going to really focus on that stuff. Right? I focused on a bunch of different things. So it's okay to kind of pick one concept and deal with it. And it's okay to take this broader, like we're going to read it and kind of see what we think and see what conclusions we come to, right? All of that is part of this annotation process, or is an option for annotation. Same with drawing. Like I said, I didn't do a lot of drawing in this one, but we got a frowny face and a happy face. Very important. And yes, Maura did just point out to me, I know there's a typo in here. It's the word wants. I was typing it very quickly. So hopefully there's not a typo in the next one, but we'll find out. It's always an adventure together. So that is an example of annotation for this chapter. I'm going to shift to the next chapter. So that was from chapter 23. I'm going to move to chapter 24. This is again kind of a long passage. We're not going to go through the whole thing, but you certainly can. So I'm going to start again by reading this. So to give you a little bit of context before, oh no, I found another typo. This is why you need proofreaders. I like this word. Osmothing should be the word something. Okay, hopefully that's the only one, but I doubt it. Okay, so Prosper, or the gang, has learned that there might be more to Scipio than they realize, and Victor tells them to go visit his address. And Prosper and the gang goes, and Prosper and Bo knock on the door and are let in, and they're waiting for Scipio to show up. Brandy says that her kids get candy when they find a typo. Well, they definitely get 2 pieces of candy from me then, because 2 so far. They might be in for quite a treat today. We'll see. When you type in a program that doesn't tell you when you have something misspelled, that makes it even more dangerous. Okay, so Prosper and Bo are waiting for Scipio to come down the stairs. They're still kind of maybe hoping that it's not true. Maybe he doesn't live in this giant, big, fancy house. Maybe it's all a ruse. Oh, I just found another typo. I'm just going to rewrite that word. There we go. That one kills me. Okay, so they are waiting. That is our context. They're waiting, hoping Scipio isn't actually this other person. And here we have it. So it says, 10 minutes can be a long time when you're waiting with a beating heart for something you don't understand, something you don't really want to know. Bo didn't seem particularly bothered by the whole thing. He was quite happy to touch the lions' heads by the fountain and to dip his hands into the cold water. But Prosper felt terrible. He felt betrayed, deceived. What was Scipio doing in this house? Who was he really? When Scipio finally appeared at the top of the stairs, Prosper stared at him as if he'd seen a ghost. Scipio stared back. His face was pale and strangely unfamiliar. Then, as he started down the stairs with the slow and heavy steps, Bo ran toward him. "Hey, Sheep," he called, stopping at the bottom of the flight. But Scipio didn't answer. He hesitated and looked at Prosper, who glared back at him until Scipio lowered his head. As he lifted it again to say something, a man appeared at the balustrade. He was tall and thin and had the same dark eyes as Scipio. "What are you still doing here?" he said in a bored voice. "Don't you have a lesson today?" He glanced briefly at Prosper and Bo. "In an hour," Scipio replied without looking up at his father. His voice sounded completely different, as if he weren't sure he'd find the right words. He even seemed smaller to Prosper, but that may have been because of the huge house or because he wasn't wearing his high-heeled boots. He was dressed like one of the rich kids Prosper had sometimes seen in expensive restaurants, sitting stiffly and eating with a knife and fork without spilling anything. This is riddled with typos. That does not instill confidence in my typing ability. Oh, sad day. Okay. We're just going to ignore all of them by fixing all of them. There you go. If your kids are ever questioning whether the editing process is necessary, you can tell them that Claire from Rooted in Language decided to speed past the editing process and went live on television with 5 or 6 typos in her thing. So that's a good lesson. All right. So to mark some of these thoughts, I'm just going to do a couple. Actually, probably just this first paragraph. There is a lot that happens in this, a lot toward the bottom between Scipio and his father, and then with Prosper kind of looking on. But even just this first paragraph, 10 minutes, I love this opening line. 10 minutes can be a long time when you're waiting with a beating heart for something you don't understand, something you don't really want to know. Oops. The author has switched into the second person, right? You're waiting. You don't understand. You don't really want to know. So it feels like she's talking to the reader, right? To the reader. But who is she actually talking about, right? And this is an important thing that sometimes, sorry, I keep moving the paper. Sometimes students don't always get, right? Because we've switched, we suddenly have this other pronoun in there. But identifying who is feeling this way, who is waiting, who doesn't understand, who doesn't really want to know. Well, the whole time we're talking about Prosper. And there is a little bit of context before this that might help clue our students in that I don't have in this section. But Prosper is the one waiting. And we know that because literally he is sitting and waiting. And I do start from that perspective. Like, what's he doing? He's sitting on a bench and he's waiting. Not very exciting, right? And I talk, you know, I do talk about too, before we even get into the emotion of it, he's sitting there for 10 minutes. Have you ever sat somewhere for 10 minutes waiting for something? It is the most boring thing you could possibly do, right? 10 minutes feels like forever, right? Can be a long time, regardless of anything else happening, right? This can feel like, oops, like forever. And then we get into the emotion that gets layered on top of it. So you're waiting with a beating heart for something you don't understand. So who's waiting? Prosper's waiting. So something Prosper doesn't understand. So what doesn't he understand? Well, he doesn't understand Scipio, right? And we can get into more. He doesn't understand why Scipio has done this. He might not understand Scipio at all anymore, right? It feels like maybe he doesn't even know him. So the thing that Prosper fails to understand is Scipio and his actions. And then something you don't really want to know. So first it was something that he doesn't understand. And now it's something he doesn't really want to know. And this is an interesting difference between this very poetic line, I think. We get this comparison and this difference that he doesn't know because he doesn't understand. So we can understand that connection. But not wanting to know something. And this can be tough too for kids because this is a very adult concept. you know, not wanting to hear something, not wanting to know something, you know, I mean, it happens to everyone, right? Kids definitely feel this as well, but having the language around it, having the ability to go, yeah, didn't need to hear that right now, right? Because this is hard. This is heartbreaking for Prosper. He doesn't want to know that Scipio has lied because that would be too much. Because he trusts Scipio. So we, again, not sure where to write all that. Here we go. So his trust is broken, right? These are all the things that he doesn't want to find out. He doesn't want to find out that Scipio lied because of what that means too. If Scipio lied about who he was, he could lie about anything. Right? If I don't tell you who I really am and where I'm really from, is our friendship real? Right? Is our brotherhood real? And so it calls into question their entire relationship. It's a huge kind of abstract concept, but one that kids can identify with. You know, they may have experienced, you know, I hope not because it's heartbreaking, but they may have experienced feeling loss over, you know, maybe they lose a friend because they grow apart, or feeling like maybe someone lied to them, right? They know what that feels like. Even if it's not, you know, totally earth shattering and everything is ruined, they probably know the feeling of that kind of, even a little betrayal. The word betrayal is such a heavy hitting word, but we have these things happen in little ways, you know, throughout our lives, and being able to pull from that feeling. Suddenly, the fact that our author uses the word you makes sense. Even though she's talking about Prosper, she is talking about a universal concept, a feeling that is shared between thousands and thousands of people, right? If you pulled a random person off the street, they would know what it feels like to be lied to, right? That sounds really depressing to say out loud. I realize I don't mean it like that. I'm not trying to be cynical, but this is something that is a big point of connection between people. Kind of universal connection, right? I might not write that exact phrase, or might have my kid write that exact phrase, but maybe the idea that people understand this feeling. Oops, I ran into my own writing here. Understand this feeling. Okay, and then by contrast, and I'm just going to finish this paragraph for today, but by contrast, Bo is not bothered by it because Bo is 5 and life is exciting when you're 5, right? Fountains with lion heads and cold water in a giant entryway of a huge mansion. That's awesome, right? That's super cool. I would probably put my hands in the fountain, but he is much more a child, while Prosper is a little bit more of an adult. And they're not hugely different in age. There are a few years between them, but Prosper is definitely has more of an adult perspective than Bo does. Bo is super happy playing around in a fountain. And then we get the contrast played up even more. So we have this line of contrast right here between their first sentence and this next sentence. And then we get even more contrast here. Prosper felt terrible, betrayed, deceived. These are heavy words. He didn't feel bad, he felt terrible. Right? He didn't feel like his friend drifted away from him, he felt betrayed. He didn't feel lied to, he felt deceived. This is all word choice. The author picks these words because they deal heavy blows. Each one is a hammer. And so we can feel how beaten down Prosper feels. You know, just sitting on a bench waiting for this person to show up, right? And you can even kind of start to imagine, because we come back to how long 10 minutes can feel, that these three words maybe, or these three feelings are just playing on repeat in his head over and over and over again. And these questions being repeated over and over again. But he doesn't want to know the answer. Right? We come back up to that idea. He's going to ask 1,000 questions constantly, and he does not want to know the answer to any of them. It's so heartbreaking. It makes me so sad. Okay. So, good example of how much meat is packed into these paragraphs, these moments, and how much you can pull out of them. And again, I went in multiple directions here. I talked about the author, which you don't have to bring up, right? We could only talk about the author's choices. Word choice, putting questions in, dealing with the second person of you. Those are all author choices. The author is very present in this paragraph. You can feel the decisions being made. Or we could ignore the author, right? Maybe that's too much to talk about. Maybe let's just talk about Prosper and his feelings in this. And maybe a little more complex than that is let's compare Prosper to Beau, right? Another thing we could do with this paragraph. Prosper versus Beau. So we kind of have three different, that's supposed to be a 1, 2, 3 different big pieces that this paragraph could be used to touch on. You can do 1, 2, or all 3 of them, right? You can pick and choose depending on how much energy your student can bring to this, depending on their age, their maturity level, how much background knowledge, how connected they feel to this. You can give and take the level of analysis, the level of annotation going on here. Those are kind of my 2 walkthrough demonstrations. And I realized kind of at the end there, I just said that it is a level of analysis. Because going back to before I even got to the demonstration, my opening point was that we have this annotation as something we want to do, and connecting with text is something we want to do, and they get woven together. Right? If we're doing annotation in this way, where we're really looking at how we think when we read and capturing that on the page and being willing to investigate, being willing to be wrong about things, being willing to question and discuss and engage. I keep using that word, engage. I sometimes talk about annotation as a written conversation. It's like me as the reader, I'm having a conversation with the book I'm reading. And the book is one side and I'm the other. And we both have to play in order for it to be a conversation. There's your metaphor for today. So it's hard. It is not an easy skill to do. I've had years of practice at it. I was taught, I have done this many, many times. But I continue to figure things out, to perfect my annotation techniques, my strategies, my knowledge. And I come from a place of being very, very familiar with this text. If it were a brand new text to me, my annotation of it would look probably fairly different. So, giving your student kind of that room to expand and room to figure out how they best want to interact. I have some students who hate to draw, so you will never see any kind of symbols or anything like that or any drawings on their page. I have other students who love to draw, and they'll whole stick figure scenes are going on, capturing the emotion of the scene, right? They might, if I gave that passage to my one student, she might draw Prosper sitting on the bench looking terrible and sad and deceived, and draw Beau playing in the fountain because he's a goofy little kid and he doesn't, all of these heavy emotions go right over him. And if she can capture those feelings in those images, I know she understands it, right? And we talk about it when she's drawing it. I actually like to draw a lot. I did very little drawing on this, which is not typical for me. I love that kind of sketch note, annotating with pictures kind of thing. So being open to that is also really important and very valuable. Don't underestimate the power of art. There's your PSA for today. Okay, so those are my demonstrations. Those are my thoughts on this middle section. Obviously, there is a lot more to this chapters 16 through 30, this revelation area. There's a lot of stuff that happens. Like I said, we kind of have to pick and choose in order to best, teach it and communicate it. But take time, if you're going through this, take a lot of time. Go through it slowly, go through it a chapter at a time, kind of thing. Welcome to today's episode of Deep Dive on Facebook Live. I am Claire Baker with Rooted in Language. This is episode 3 of the series, of the Deep Dive series, all about The Thief Lord by Cornelia Funke. Jacket cover coming off there. Part 1 was all about introducing the story, introducing characters, because that is our primary kind of mode of analysis that I will be walking through. So part 2 was an introduction, part 1 was an introduction. Part 2 was called The Revelation, where we learned new things, uncovered new realities, new truths about some of our characters, a lot of our characters. And today's episode is called The Uncertainty, because we kind of entered Act 3 of the book, if we want to think about it as kind of this 4-part or 4-act story. And this third section introduces new complexities, new elements to the story, new layers to characters that lead to a lot of uncertainty, a lot of kind of guessing, figuring stuff out, starting to sift through the layers that are kind of mysterious about this story and about our characters. So a lot of unknowns, a lot of unsureness, unsurety. I don't know what the form is of that word. A lot of being unsure. Let's go with that. So that is what this section primarily deals with, at least in my opinion, when looking at it. And stuff that I will be talking about today will kind of help with analyzing all of that uncertainty. It's a way to look at everything that we don't really fully know yet, and kind of some of the guesswork, some of the unfolding that we do when we read. So that is everything. Oh, I meant to have my mask on today. I was going to have it perched on my head while I was teaching. So that'll hang out. That's going to get really distracting, isn't it? Okay. All right. We won't mess with that. Okay. So I have my notes in front of me here. I actually wanted to kind of backtrack slightly to cover something that would be in the last section, simply because it's a really, really good bits and pieces of writing, which last time I demonstrated really annotation, which is a good way to get little pieces of writing going, get your student kind of engaged, get them holding the pen. And that is one of the things I like to practice a lot with my students, is making sure, they're the ones who are engaged, they're directly involved in the writing. But writing isn't always big chunks, right? Big paragraphs, big pieces of text. Sometimes writing comes in the form of a single word, a phrase, sentence here and there, right? A way of interacting. And there's lots and lots of opportunities to do that when you're analyzing a book. Last week brought up a lot of kind of discussion questions or topics for discussion. Anytime we have that, we can also translate that into writing, which I did talk about last week. And last week also brought up sort of kind of these key moments or key decision-making times. And anytime our characters are involved in a hard decision, we as the readers are also involved in that difficult decision. And in particular, referencing back, they had captured Victor. They had held him, our gang had held him in the Star Palace. And there was kind of this question of what to do with him. And all the characters are debating about it, which actually gives us as the reader the opportunity to also debate about it. So I just wanted to show, kind of demonstrate this really quickly as the introduction kind of thing here. Let me get my paper. Many stacks of paper. Okay, so there are other decisions that happen throughout the book at various points, and this is why I wanted to come back and cover this as a good example, but you can use this strategy anytime other decisions are being debated. So with this example of capturing Victor, sorry, so they've captured Victor. We have kind of two sides, right? We have pros and cons, essentially, of keeping Victor chained up, right? Keeping him locked up in the bathroom. And so we can set up a pros and cons chart. And this might be around a whole conversation that I would have with a student. But we would be doing some writing, and we might share the writing. They might do all of the writing. We might go back and forth, right? But we do get kind of both of us involved. And we would set up, and it can be messy. It can be right on, just a piece in your notebook, a piece in kind of a stack of paper. If you're doing this kind of little pieces of writing all about the book, it deepens our understanding, and we end up with this kind of packet of knowledge that we've created and gathered while we were reading. So if we talk about, okay, what's a pro, what's a positive thing that can come of having Victor captured? And something we might say is, well, if he's captured, he can't call Esther. And since they don't want him to call Esther, that's a pretty positive thing, right? Since he's captured, he won't be able to force them to leave the Star Palace, so the gang can still live in the Star Palace. Which means that they are sort of safe. The gang is safe. Whoops, they are. Saying one thing and writing something different. Always fun. They are safe. And I have had this conversation with students, and they come up with this idea sometimes that now that they've captured Victor, they are safe. Which leads us immediately over to the negative sides, where I ask, are they actually safe that they have Victor locked up in a bathroom? Right? What could actually come from that? And we usually get to the idea that they can't keep him forever. You can't just keep a guy locked up in the bathroom for the rest of forever. Right? That's not going to go very well. And we come to the question of morality. We're back to that kind of ongoing theme that capturing him is wrong. Right? Locking him up is wrong. It's also illegal, but morally, if we're dealing with just a moral perspective, not a legal perspective, it's wrong. We could add that it's also illegal if we wanted to include those maybe as two separate ideas. And so we get this kind of debate back and forth, which leads us back to that original pro of they are safe, and kind of gets a big question mark after it, right? Are they actually safe? Is this actually a good decision? And your child might think, yeah, it's a great decision. Or they might realize, yeah, maybe it's not a good decision. I don't know. And you have a whole conversation around this single moment, the single decision that was made. And it can lead to them doing a bit of writing and you having that richer, deeper understanding of what's happening and the complexity of this choice. So this kind of writing, this very, like I said, it's kind of messy, kind of just thrown together. You could do it on Post-it notes, right? We can do it just on a piece of paper like I've done. This kind of thing is a great way to further that engagement and further understand the decisions our characters are making, the reasons behind those decisions, if we agree or disagree with those decisions, right? And that this can kind of lead to the question of what would you do, right? If you were a part of the gang and they wanted to capture Victor, you know, would you agree with them? Would you go along with it, right? How would you behave? Which is really great conversation. So just a nice kind of small look back at something that happened in the previous section, but a really good strategy. And there will be other decisions and other choices that our characters make that this kind of like pro and con, pros versus cons chart can be really helpful, especially if they're really complex choices, right? Particularly when we deal with Scipio, who is becoming rapidly a more and more complex character, and is often sometimes difficult for kids to wrap their heads around. And so doing this kind of like breakdown that becomes a little more black and white, right? Where we can see this is one choice, this is the other, right? Good, bad, positive, negative, whatever it might be, can help get into this more complex mindset, which is where we're heading today, into complex things. The land of complexity. I don't know. Okay. So one of the mini lessons I like to do with my students actually comes from annotating literary elements. It is in, I think, the very first part of, I think it's in the first section. It's a small portion in there, but it is a valuable one. Where we talk about kind of traits or types of character. And if I'm reading a lot of books with a student, or we've, you know, over time, we've gathered a bunch of books, I love to have this mini lesson kind of thrown in. So we have lots of examples of characters. So I'm going to walk through this with you guys so that we can add our characters to this kind of chart that we're going to make. I'm going to go back to the document camera. So if I know that we're going to be using this chart, I might do it on like a really big poster, big piece of paper or something, or I might just do it on a regular, like just like an 8.5 by 11 kind of sheet of paper. Ooh, that is not a straight line. That's supposed to be a chart. There we go. Okay, and I talk about the 4 types of character we can have. And there's kind of 2 sides to it. And this top to bottom one, I tend to define as round, characters up at the top, and flat down at the bottom. And I will define, oh, if I want those to fit, there we go. I will define these terms. That a round character is someone who has multiple sides. They are more like a real person. They have keep coming back to the word complex, right? There are complexities to them. There's more than just one side going on. And we might write the definition down below. We might have another page where we define these. And I actually like to indicate, I like to circle it because it's round, right? Like a circle. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. There we go. So you can see that a little better. And then the opposite of round is flat. And these are characters that don't have more than one side. They're very simple. They're very straightforward. It's kind of what you see is what you get, which I like to indicate with a nice flat line, right? We have this difference. So we kind of have a spectrum of round to flat. And then going the other way, we have a spectrum of static to dynamic, which I can't fit afterwards. There we go, dynamic. And we would define these as well. So static characters are characters who don't change throughout the story. They are who they are. They don't change at all, which I tend to indicate with like a dot, right? It's right there. They stay. We might even talk about what the word static means, right? To be static, to be stationary, to be unmoving. Versus on this kind of left to right spectrum, we have the concept of being dynamic. I do is like a little squiggly arrow. And dynamic characters do change. We see a shift. We see movement, maybe in their personality and their behavior, something about them. If it helps, if you have a student who knows music, we talk about what dynamics are, right? Different volume levels. And to have something that is dynamic means that it shifts, right? Or changes. So we get a lot of kind of other words, other contexts we can pull on for defining these terms. And what we end up with is this nice kind of, what's the word I want? It's like a grid, like an XY, but I can't think of the word at all. A grid of options, kind of these quadrants, right? Where we can have characters. And we would start talking about the characters that we know so far. And we might start with Scipio, because I feel like he is, especially in this third section, we get to see more of him. And we talk about, is he round or flat? Does he have, more than one side? Is there more to him? Is he complex, or is he straightforward? This is all there is, nothing else. We say, well, we do learn other things about him, and he does behave in ways we might not expect. He's got some interesting choices that he makes, right? We don't know everything about him, so we might put him more in this round category. And we can start to talk about, because we're nearing the end of the book, whether he has stayed the same or whether he has changed. Or even if we haven't gotten that far yet, do we think that he's going to make a change or not? And then we can kind of place him in the quadrant where we think he belongs. And personally, I think that he is round and he is dynamic. So he belongs over here. Point for Scipio, right? And we might do this with multiple characters. And it sometimes can be difficult partway through a book, unless you have very, very clear examples. This is sometimes a better thing to do at the very end. But you might talk about this and kind of get these ideas in their head, and maybe even reference other books they know, right? Other stories they know. It's like, oh, we just read Harry Potter, and we're going to talk about the fact that, over the whole span of the Harry Potter books, maybe Harry is round and dynamic, or maybe he doesn't change at all. Maybe he's static, right? And you can have this, you can kind of use this tool for any character you might be talking about. And the other thing that can happen, especially kind of partway through a book, is with a character who is a little more subtle, maybe like Prosper. We talked about, he's not always obvious in his behaviors and in his, kind of how he chooses to do things and why he chooses to do things. Students might think that there's only one side to him. Maybe he's a little flat. They might think that he doesn't change, right? And they might want to put somebody like Prosper down here, which is okay at this point, right? And we might be having further conversations. Well, I would want to be having further conversations, and they might change their mind. They might go, you know what? I thought that he belonged here, but actually, I think he's up here with Scipio, right? And so stuff can move, right? Which maybe you want to do these on Post-it notes. I don't know when you're reading a book, and so you can kind of move them around as you understand new things about them. And then, creating that kind of big chart, like I said, have it up on your wall, have your giant, character types chart for all these books you've read, all these movies you've watched, right? And you can really see kind kind of the difference between different kinds of characters. So to give you an example of kind of the opposite, I might, and this is very much up for debate, right? It's a lot of personal thoughts, but I might put Beau, who is much younger. He's kind of very just playful. He wants to have fun. He wants to be with his brother. He doesn't make a lot, he doesn't change a whole lot throughout our story. He remains pretty much the same. So I would put him more on the static side, and we might debate whether he is rounded, maybe a little more complex, or if he's kind of just what you see is what you get with Beau. So we might debate if he belongs here or here, right? And that debate, that conversation is definitely a huge part, very well worth having with every character that we add to this chart. Okay, so that is my character types chart. Kind of keep that running as you're reading the book, as you near the end. Once you get to the end, we'll come back to this next week and kind of touch base on this again. Two different really good strategies, ongoing little pieces of writing, the pros and cons chart and that character types chart. Ongoing. Okay. Which brings me to kind of the main thing that I wanted to talk about today with this section. So once we've gotten into this, what is it? It's chapters kind of what, 31 through 42, I think was the portion, or 30 through 42. We are understanding more and more about each of our characters, or at least seeing more and more of each of our characters. We've met Ida Spavento, Signora Spavento, and we've gotten to see her a little bit more and how she interacts with the kids. We have met, we've seen the Conte a little bit more and how he's behaving. We've seen interactions between Scipio and the gang now that they know Scipio's true identity, now that everything's been uncovered. We get to see how Scipio's dealing with this sort of realization that everyone has, and the betrayal that they feel, like we talked about last week, and how this continues to unfold, and how, you know, he's fighting for what he wants. He's fighting for his friendships with people. He's fighting against being a child. That's kind of an ongoing theme throughout this, right? And the story of the wing and the merry-go-round has come about, and we have this kind of magical element that's been introduced, this possibility of becoming an adult by riding this magical merry-go-round, and Scipio's obsession with it. So we get all this furthering of characters. And at the same time that all of that happens, winter fully arrives in Venice. And I think at the very end of chapter 30, the gang's dealing with Barbarossa, which is always a fun time, and they step outside and it's snowing. And it's the first time, I think even Hornet observes, or Victor, one of them observes, that it hasn't snowed in Venice in years. And these big fat flakes are falling from the sky, and everything is gray, but then being covered in this sort of beautiful crystal, you know, white. It's cold, but it's exciting. And I love talking about weather in books. I think weather is a really, really neat tool that authors have the ability to use. It's kind of one of my many obsessions in stories is focusing on weather. I sometimes equate it to in movies, we are given a sense of kind of the tone and the mood of the scene by the music that's playing, right? I always use Jaws as the classic example of like, something bad is gonna happen, dun, dun, dun. It's like, I can feel it, right? You can feel this tension coming from music, which is an amazing tool that cinematographers and directors get to use. Authors don't get that. They don't get to use music. I think it would be very strange if you opened a book and the scene you were reading started playing music. It'd be kind of cool. Instead, they have other kind of scene setting tools, other mood setting tools. And one of the primary ones is weather. We don't get to pick the weather. We get to go outside and go, hey, it's raining. Woohoo, right? I had no choice over that. It has no effect on, you know, if I have a good day, bad day, whatever it is. It's sort of the weather's happening and then I'm happening. But in a book, they get completely woven together. So we have to ask ourselves this kind of question of, if it's snowing, if the author spent all this time focusing on the weather, why? Right? We now as readers have to spend time focusing on it. We have to kind of unpack the reason behind this weather change. And one of the ways I like to do that, you can talk about all kinds of features of weather. I don't think there's a wrong way to do it. But in particular, one of the features of winter, and I recently did this with a student, so I have a lot of his language around this, which is really cool. So this is not, you know, not all just coming from me. This is coming from one of my students. We started talking about snow. I actually have this like messy page full of Post-its and arrows and stuff. But we started talking about snow and all of the features of snow. And he explained, he's like, oh, I love snow. Snow is great. You can go out, you can play in it, you can build snowmen, you can have snowball fights, you can go sledding, right? All of this fun stuff that goes with snow. And I was like, yeah, that's really cool. I love snow too. And I said, but is winter, is it always fun? Is every single moment about it the coolest moment ever? He's like, well, no, it's also, you can get ice, right? You can get stuck in snow, right? If a huge blizzard comes through or something, it's super cold, and it can also be kind of dangerous, right? If you're trapped out in it, if it's, you know, if you're driving and it's icy, right? There's a lot of danger associated with winter and cold and snow. And I said, okay, so we have this kind of duality, right? And I know, right? Big flags going off here because this is one of our themes. We have two sides to this concept of winter. We have beauty and kind of peace and calm and fun and play that goes with it. And we also have this kind of dark, dangerous, icy, frozen side to it. So we get these two parts. And we know these things. If you're experienced with snow, and maybe if you live somewhere where it never snows, you don't know this thing, but we know as snow experienced people that we can experience both of these things, that we encounter both of these sides. And actually Maura just made a really, really nice point that snow is also a bit mysterious. It kind of adds to our uncertainty thing because it covers everything, right? You can't tell what things are anymore when they're covered in a blanket of snow. It obscures things. So we set up some Post-its of kind of the good side of snow and the bad side of snow, looking at these two parts. And we went from there and created kind of a statement, a sentence about it. And he said, I'm going to read you exactly what he said. He said, snow can be really fun when you play in it, but it can also be dangerous if you get stuck in it. Great kind of conclusion to pull from this, right? So we went from this very specific and we generalized it a little bit. I said, can we apply this kind of two-sided thing to people? This is true of people. And he said, yeah. And he wrote, people can be nice sometimes, but when you get to know them, they might be mean. So we have two sides again. And then we went even more general. I said, is that always true? Is it always true that nice people turn out to be mean people? It's like, well, no, right? Sometimes nice people are nice people. Sometimes mean people turn out to be nice people, right? We talked about how we have all those kind of exceptions to this statement that he said. And we generalized even further to this statement that people can have more than one side. They are not always one thing once you get to know them. And we came up with essentially a thesis statement, right? Kind of an argument, this boiled down underlying concept that we could apply to this story. because we have a ton of examples. And we came to a conclusion about characters, about people, that we actually started by talking about weather. So we got there kind of a little bit of a strange path, and yet it led us to this amazing theme, right? This theme of duality, this theme of uncertainty about who someone is, multi-sidedness, right? Multifacetedness. A lot of really good words today, like multifacetedness. That's a great one. Put that one in your dictionaries. Okay. So from that, we started with weather. We moved to weather-specific statements. We moved to people-specific statements, and then got to this place of theme. And then we turned around and applied that theme, that concept, back to all of our characters. So it's very roundabout. This is the messy part of how we think. I talked a lot last week about the chaos of the thought process and the chaos of the writing process. This is part of it, right? We're not arriving at something linearly. We're not arriving at something in a straight line, right? We don't just magically get there, jump to this amazing conclusion about this entire story. And here's all my evidence, right? We have to take strange turns and we loop back on ourselves and we pick stuff up as we understand more, right? It's messy, but it's also fun. Like snow, it's got two sides to it. So I'm going to walk through this with a couple examples of characters. I have just kind of a blank chart that I'll be filling out. But I started with the idea of winter. I'm going to have to write smaller if I'm going to fit anything else on this page. Okay, winter. And we have two boxes. And I don't necessarily define these as good and bad because they're not always going to be that way for every character. For the example of winter, it is kind of good versus bad. But you know, that won't always work every time. But we basically kind of separate the two sides. So we said that it can be playful, fun, beautiful. We use the word mesmerizing, which I just love as a word. Fantastic word. And then what's the other side? Well, it can be cold. It can be treacherous. That's a good word. It can be dangerous. Maura's point about it being mysterious, we might actually have a debate about whether the word mysterious is a good quality or a bad quality. And it can sometimes be both, right? So I might even write it kind of in the middle here. It kind of belongs in both camps, right? Sometimes that's a cool, fun thing. Sometimes that's terrifying, right? And then we created kind of a sentence from this. We did a little bit of analysis, kind of combining some evidence and some analysis. And I wrote his statement. I already read this to you. That he says snow can be fun when you play in it, but it can also be dangerous when you get stuck in it. So I might write something like that down here, right? Snow can be fun, but can also be dangerous, right? We might fill that space with that kind of analysis type conclusion that we've come to about the idea of winter. And then we're going to move to a character. And I like to start with Scipio because I feel like in this example of having multiple sides, he is very clear cut. So what is one side of Scipio? Well, we might side with his thief lord side. So on one side, he's the thief lord. He's a liar. My students always like to point that out right from the start. He lied. But as the thief lord, he is also powerful. He's in charge. He's confident. He's maybe arrogant. Right? All these features. And then on the other side, he's just the young Master Massimo, right? He's just kind of a regular kid. And we get to see him in this environment, and he is small. Right? That's always a word some of my students really like to use. He looks and feels small. He's ineffective. He gets bullied by his dad and bossed around. Right? Insecure, Morgan, that's a really nice word, yeah. Really good word for it. Oops, that looks like a W, doesn't it? Insecure. I don't think that helped. Okay. And so from this kind of evidence almost that we see, right, these are the things we get to see about Scipio, we're going to come up with maybe a sentence or two, maybe a phrase that kind of combines some of this idea. And some of the stuff, again, I'm pulling from what my student wrote about this, but he says that Scipio has more than one side. Scipio has more than one side. He's been lying about his different sides to different people, right? He actually is a liar here. He's also a liar over here. He didn't tell his dad that he's the thief lord. And when his friends learn about it, they're angry, they're disappointed, right? Lying about both sides, right? Hiding them, even come back to the idea of being mysterious. There's a lot of hiding going on here. Okay, I'm going to do two more characters as an example here. I'm going to do Prosper next because I think, again, he's a little bit more of a complex character because he's not always as obvious. We have kind of the one side of Prosper that hates stealing, right? That wants to keep Bo safe. That he will protect Bo, that he's kind of Bo's guardian, right? And that he wants to stay away maybe from Esther. He wants to escape Esther, right? We have all these ideas. And then on the other side, each of these kind of opposite, that he also recognizes that he has to stay alive, right? He has to survive. And he also starts to recognize that he is not Bo's parent. And Bo knows this as well, right? He even kind of yells it at him at one point where it's like, you're not mom, right? You can't order me around. It's a very difficult position for him to be in. And even though he wants to escape Esther, he also recognizes that he needs protection and safety. That they both, or all of them, need protection and safety. He has a very mature perspective in recognizing kind of these things, all these things at the same time. And so we can come to this, kind of conclusion type statement, right? That Prosper does not support a lifestyle of stealing, but he recognizes he has to survive. He wants to give Bo a good home, but he will not give him over to Esther, right? Not support, I'm just going to write one of those down. Support stealing, but recognizes they must survive somehow. Right, two sides. Two pieces. I'm going to do one more. I'm going to do Victor. I have another, oops, got to find my other page. Because Victor is actually one that my student did this whole thing with, and I had never really thought of Victor as having multiple sides. I thought he was kind of a you know, what you see is what you get kind of person. And my student pointed out, and this kind of makes me laugh, that on the one side, he is a detective. He's a PI, right? Private investigator. He is a hard worker. He is here to do his job, right? He has a job that he is paid to do. And he's going to do it, right? He even has a good reputation. He always, you know, gets what he's looking for. He always finds stuff, you know, whatever he's paid to do. And then we get to see him feeling for Prosper and Bo. He really does feel for them. It's a little fuzzy, isn't it? Don't know if I can fix it. Okay. He's actually very friendly and generous. And while that idea is not directly opposed to these, it is kind of this other side, right? And he actually protects the gang a little bit. And this is my favorite thing about this, is my student said, he catches thieves for a job. That is what his job is. And yet he's over here making friends with thieves, which is just fantastic. He's paid to catch thieves and turns around and makes friends with a bunch of them. Because life is not that simple, right? Life is not so straightforward that you're like, yep, it's my job to catch thieves. That's what I'm going to do. Hands down, no problem, no questions, right? It's much more complicated than that. And we see it painted over and over again in different colors with different characters, right? This complexity, this uncertainty. And each of these is a perfect example of kind of the idea of like cognitive dissonance, which is just another great phrase, that, you know, you're holding two opposing concepts in your mind at the same time, right? And I think part of why Prosper is difficult and why he's kind of more subtle is because he does that a lot. He's holding the idea that they need safety and they need protection and they, you know, would benefit from being in someone's home and having a parental type figure. He knows that and is simultaneously holding on to the fact that, nope, it can't be Esther. We got to make it on our own. If we're going to survive, it's on us, right? And these are opposing ideas that this kid is holding right next to each other in his brain. And it leads him to behave certain ways. It leads him to make certain decisions. And, you know, it's very, very real too, because this is something that we do as human beings all the time, right? Decisions we make, choices we have are constantly fluctuating between, well, here's the simple answer, but here's also the simple answer that directly opposes that, right? And we have to be able to understand that. And I think as kids, you know, that's one of the things we wrestle with as like going through maturity and growing up is recognizing these different sides, that life is not black and white. And sometimes things that seem so simple and so clear are actually very difficult and can help us understand other people better, right? There's a lot of empathy that's buried in that. And so the more we can connect with these characters, the more we can, you know, sort of uncover this in ourselves, realize it in other people, right? And start to build this whole network of understanding. Excuse me. So I think most of the characters at this point in the story, you can actually be doing this kind of charting about. You know, you can do it about Ida Spavento and her personality. We can do it about Barbarossa and decide, does he actually have more than one side, or is he exactly how he presents himself? We can do it with Scipio's father. Again, that same kind of question. Going back to the chart, as we talk about each of these characters, you know, we can do one of these little kind of breakdowns of them. Like, well, do they change? Do they have more than one side? Are they more complex than what they present? No? Okay. Maybe they're a flat character. Maybe they're a static character, right? Or maybe the answer is yes. And maybe that makes them dynamic and round, right? So we can really start to see this, not quite a balance, it's like a teeter-totter, right? We're moving back and forth, understanding things, seeing the different sides of things. So a really, really great activity. And from here, you can leave it at this, right? You have your big static, dynamic, round, flat chart. You maybe are doing, bits of charting on these characters. And that's where you leave it, right? That's really, really great analysis, really digging deep. You can take it even further though, right? Now you have a bunch of sort of evidence and analysis statements that we can compile and start to work into even like an argument paper, right? We have our thesis that people can have more than one side. Well, now we've just piled up all our evidence and all our analysis. I wasn't grabbing specific quotes to support my evidence, but you certainly could, right? Let's go find a quote that proves that Scipio is, small when he's at home. Okay, let's go find that scene and grab a good quote from it, right? And that's not something I was talking about here about finding good quotes, but certainly a layer you can add if you want to go that extra step, right? And thinking too that it all started with this perspective about weather. So don't ignore weather in books. The author spent time putting it in there. You should spend time pulling it out, right? It's all good stuff, all very good stuff. So I hope this finds you well and you are ready to come with me into the final part of our journey with our deep dive on Facebook with the book, The Thief Lord. I feel like every time I hold this up, I notice the Post-its that are in it. And this one is actually not for me at least, not a heavily post-ited book, but it always pops into my head. It always comes to my attention whenever I hold it up. But there's lots of life and color going on in this book. And I don't know, it makes me laugh because some of the Post-its are from what I'm doing right now as reminders to myself, like these big yellow Post-its are different sections so that I can remember the quotes I'm pulling and talking about. And then some of them are for things I'm doing with my students, and some of them I could not tell you why there are Post-its there anymore. They are, well, not purposeless. They do have a purpose, or they had a purpose at some point, but I have since completely forgotten. I may not have even been the one who put the Post-it note there in the first place. So kind of fun to just leave them in there. They entertain me at least. My student who I just finished this book with, we have Post-its throughout the whole book with writing on it, all over it. And we just finished up and finished talking about it. And I was really excited to get to the end. I'm pointing out all this great work that he's done and all this effort he's put into it. And he's nodding, and then he goes, "So can I take all my Post-its out?" I was like, "Well, I guess if you want to. We got to save them though." And he's like, "Oh, well, it's a library book." I'm like, okay. So yes, we can't keep the Post-it notes in the book because we have to return it to the library. But this is actually a great note. If you do have Post-its in a library book or in a book that you want to return, or your kid just gets really upset about having Post-its stuck in a book, I always make my students save their Post-its on like a piece of, like we'll just grab, paper and blank paper and stick them all over it, and we'll label it Thief Lord. And he has to keep that page. So he's not allowed to just crumple up and throw away all of his Post-its. That's a no-go. I'm not okay with that. He has to have proof of the effort that he put into it. But that's a good way to save those. So, started off with a fun Post-it tip for you in case you were in need of one of those. All right. So we are finally at the end of the book, at least the end of talking about the book. I love the ending. I love every part of this book. I don't know why I keep specifying like different sections, like that's going to change anything. I love the whole book. But the final kind of 10-ish chapters that I'm going to be talking about is really interesting and kind of takes some unexpected turns and some moments that you don't see coming, right? Just kind of an ongoing theme throughout the book, right? Things that are unexpected, unusual moments, kind of surprising times. So I have called part 4 of this, which is chapters 43 to 53, so 43 to the end. And I call this portion the turn. And typically, so the term, the turn, those sound really similar. The phrase, the turn, actually comes from poetry. And it specifically comes from Shakespearean sonnets, although it also appears in other poems as well. Haikus also use turns, which is kind of cool. So in a Shakespearean sonnet, we know we have the standard kind of rhyme scheme of A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F. And then there's the last 2 lines that are a rhyming couplet. So they break the rhyme scheme, and these last 2 lines are called the turn because they are typically a moment in the poem where something happens, some kind of phrasing or visual or explanation that causes you to see the whole poem slightly differently. It might make you realize something about the whole poem. It might open up kind of a new perspective about it, right? Or you were interpreting it one way, and then these last 2 lines cause you to go, oh, whoa, here's a totally new perspective, right? So that's what those last 2 lines are referred to as, is the turn. In a haiku, we have our 3 lines of 575 syllables. Again, typically that last line is the turn, this little moment that causes you to kind of read the whole poem slightly differently, and has sort of lasting consequences on the piece of writing. So this final portion of the book is named that, or at least I've named it that, because it kind of has that effect. There's this train of the story that's moving along, and there are unexpected things along the way. There are hiccups and bumps and shifts that happen. And then we reach this last portion, and it's kind of like everything, the whole thing just like turns left slightly. You're like, oh, everything has changed. Consequences are rippling out, right, from these choices, from our character behaviors, all of this rippling. Like I said, there's just sort of ongoing consequences that you did not foresee way back at the beginning, even in the middle, or even in that kind of 3rd portion. You're still kind of, I don't know what's going to happen, and they're finally revealed in this last turn. So a good little moment actually to talk about a poetry feature, especially if your kids are unfamiliar with that concept. Kind of a fun one to look for in stories. It does happen. Mostly happens in poetry, at least most obviously. So little moment. Anytime I can weave poetry into my story analysis, it's always a good moment for me. So okay, so I'm going to dive into this last portion. I have a couple things that I'm kind of going to be talking about today. I have one big quote that I want to take a look at, and I thought I did really, really well, and I thought I caught all the typos, but of course I missed one. So there's one typo. I'm afraid to even say that. I say that and there's going to be more, but as far as what I found, there's one typo. So I'm going to read through that. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And then kind of some ending, like wrap up ideas. And again, it's very spoiler heavy because when unusual and unexpected things happen in a story, there's no way to talk about it without being spoiler heavy. So apologies ahead of time, per usual, on that front. All right. So with this quote, to give a little context, so we kind of have just a little bit more information about it before I read it. We know there's this magical element to this story. this idea of the merry-go-round has been introduced and was talked about previously, and we learned the story of the wing that belonged to the lion on the merry-go-round. And supposedly this merry-go-round is magical and it can turn people into children, right? If you ride it, you become young again. And in theory, if you ride it the other way, you become an adult. So it's kind of this, I don't know, time travel-y kind of magical merry-go-round. And Scipio and Prosper have located it, right? They know where it is. They found it on the island. And they're discussing riding this merry-go-round and with the two people, the Conte, who is now a young boy, and his sister, who is now a young girl, because they rode it and became young. So they're having this conversation. They're kind of arguing a little bit about the merry-go-round. So it's from chapter 43. So it says, "No, he isn't," Morosina answered for her brother. "But you," she looked at Scipio appraisingly, "you're from a noble family, aren't you? I can tell from the way you talk, even the way you walk. Do you have a girl to pick up your dirty pants when you throw them on the floor? Someone to polish your boots and make your bed? Someone barely older than you? You can't possibly have any reason for wanting to ride the merry-go-round. So what are you doing here? If it's the money you want, we haven't got it." Scipio hung his head. He traced the patterns on the floor with the tip of his boot. "You're right. There is someone who picks up my things," he said without lifting his head. "And I do have my clothes laid out for me in the morning, but I hate it. My parents treat me like I'm too stupid to put my own pants on. Scipio, wash your hands after you've touched the cat. Scipio, don't step into puddles. For goodness sake, Scipio, do you have to be quite so clumsy all the time? Scipio, just shut up. You don't know anything about it, you little flea, you useless weed." Scipio now looked Morosina in the eye. "We read the story of Peter Pan at school. Do you know what? He's a stupid boy, and you and your brother are just like him, turning yourselves into children so that adults can push you around and laugh at you again. Yes, I do want to take a ride. That's why I came to this island. But I want to ride it in the other direction. I want to be grown up. Grown up, grown up." Pretty intense segment here. So I wanted to do, I demonstrated a lot of, what's the word I want? Annotating last week. And the week before we talked a lot about kind of finding different pieces. I wanted to do just a quick kind of moment with this because this particular scene, this exchange between Morosina and Scipio brings up one of the major themes that I've touched on, talked about a little bit throughout everything here, but it is very present throughout the story, and it's particularly present in this section. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so we get just a little closer. That's really close. So the theme I'm talking about is adulthood versus childhood, which I'm going to put up here. Adulthood versus childhood, which I think I brought up in either the first or second part of this as one of the themes that when you know the story beforehand, when you go into reading it, you can be kind of really honing in on finding examples of a particular theme. So you can find really good passages that you think, really fit that, and you can help even kind of, tune your child a little bit to like, okay, what's going on here a little bit, or does this fit the theme? Maybe if we established it already, does this example fall into that category? And it also touches on some other really big ideas in this section. So it starts off with Morosina really kind of laying into Scipio a little bit, right? She has all of these questions. And I even like to kind of like circle all of the question marks. Like, okay, there's one. Let's see. There's one. There's one. There's one. Oops, and there's another one. I knew there were a bunch of them. So in this paragraph, she has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions. And I try to read it. I like, I read out loud with my students a lot, and we'll trade off. And if we can get kind of intonation into this reading, and I try to impart it a little bit to when I'm reading for my kids, that when you ask someone a bunch of questions, kind of quick fire, really rapid over and over again, and he doesn't get a chance to respond, and what kind of feeling that imparts, right? These are very accusatory questions, right? So she's accusing him of all of these things. She's not actually listening for an answer, right? Is she actually asking him, hey, Scipio, I'm wondering, do you have someone who makes your bed? Right? That's not the way she's asking them. She's accusing him of having someone to polish his boots and having someone to make his bed who's probably not any older than he is, right? So kind of the number one feeling, hope I spelled that correctly, is that she is accusing him of these things. And again, I've pulled this out of context, so we have to kind of keep that in mind. There's a little bit of information that we learned earlier about that Morosina and the Conte aren't actually, he's not actually a count. They were actually children of the house, I think the housemaid, right? So they grew up as servants for a very wealthy family. So she and Scipio are opposites. They live in the same environment. They both live in, the big mansion and had this experience of this giant house, but from a totally different perspective. That Scipio is the wealthy son, right? Who has all of this stuff, all this privilege. And she is the one who provides all of this stuff. She's the one who comes in and makes his bed and picks up his clothes, right? Now, they didn't actually have this relationship, right? She didn't actually work for Scipio, but they have this connection point. And from Morosina's perspective, it's not a good connection, right? She doesn't want to actually be spending time with the people who were in charge of her life, right? Who caused, or who, I can't even think of the word I want here, that she was serving, right? That she was a servant for. And so it's a really good, she doesn't outright say, I was a servant and you're from a noble family and therefore I don't like you. Right? She doesn't actually say that she doesn't like Scipio, and yet we can infer that from these accusing questions, from kind of a mocking tone a little bit. She can tell by the way that he talks, by the way that he walks, right? What on earth could he be doing here, right? Like, why would you come down to this level even? What could you possibly want to do with any of this? Is that she does not like him, right? And the interesting thing to keep in mind about Morosina, and coming back up to kind of this theme, is she was an adult until about 2 days ago. She is now a child again. And this whole paragraph, kind of feels, or it kind of calls into question, I guess, if it feels like, would an adult talk to another adult that way? Maybe, maybe not, I don't know. Would a child talk to, or kind of a teenager, right? If we remember, Scipio is a teenager. Would a teenager talk to another teenager that way? Would an adult talk to a child that way? And kind of this, by asking and kind of answering those questions, we get a sense of a little bit more of who Morosina is and what she's been through, right? What her experiences are, even though she's kind of a more minor character, right? She doesn't have a huge role, but she has a really nice role across from Scipio. So it's sort of this Morosina, excuse me, versus Scipio a little bit. And they actually become, we can pull in a nice little literary term, they become foils, sort of, where they are a similar person, right? They're a similar age now. They have sort of overlapping experiences, and yet they stand at opposition to each other, right? They are a little bit of foils for each other in this moment. Then we move on to Scipio's response. He answers her, right? Even though she does, she asks all these sort of mocking, accusing questions, he actually does answer her. Yep, somebody does pick up my things, and lays them out. So he picks up my things, clothes get laid out, but I hate it. And we come to his feelings. And we've known this about Scipio for a while now. We know his relationship with his dad. We know how he feels about his life. Otherwise, he wouldn't have gone and become the Thief Lord if he didn't hate his current life or find a problem with his current life. And then this whole section that's in italics in the book, I know that this printing is not a huge distinction between the italics and the regular print, but it is in italics. And this is a tough one sometimes for students to pick up on, that Scipio is still talking, but he's taking on a new tone and kind of pretending to be someone else. And sometimes students do miss this, right? Where it's kind of like, what is he doing? What's he talking about? Well, he just finished explaining that his parents treat him like he's too stupid. So he's taking on the role of his parents, or kind of his interpretation of his parents. And I love doing this with kids because we talk about like, oh, do you ever mock, the way if your mom tells you to do something, she's like, go take out the trash. And you're like, go take out the trash, right? You do that terrible, like whiny, biting tone. And I love reading this. I'll have my kids actually read it like that. Scipio, wash your hands after you've touched the cat. Scipio, don't step into puddles. And they really get it, right? Kind of adopting this ridiculous tone can really help them, clue them into what he's doing. Because it's complicated. There are layers going on here. Because on the one layer, he is mocking his parents. Oops, I gotta move this up a little bit. But then we come to this last line. Scipio, just shut up. You don't know anything about it. You little flea, you useless weed. And I like to ask, do you actually think his parents called him a little flea or a useless weed? That's pretty mean, right? Do you actually, like, would your parents call you a useless weed? It's like, well, okay, maybe not. Maybe they would. I don't know. They could be pretty mean. But they might not actually be calling him that. And so it becomes a question of, why does he say that? So he's no longer just mocking his parents. He's now sort of getting into his parents' opinion of him. And then we go one step further and I say, is that, is that actually his parents' opinion of him? Well, no, maybe not. But it's what Scipio thinks is his parents' opinion of him, right? So this is, it's kind of convoluted. Scipio's opinion of his parents' opinion. Oops. Of him. So he's, we're kind of messing with if he's actually being accurate or not, right? And his own bias about what his parents think, which actually is more reflective of his opinion of his parents. and specifically his dad. We don't get to really see his mom at all, right? But what this actually shows us is Scipio's opinion of his dad. Even though it feels like kind of in that first or a couple layers that it's his parents' opinion, it is actually completely his opinion. And it may be based in reality, right? Some reality, that his parents probably do say some of this stuff to him. He's probably heard this a bunch of times, right? But maybe not this final hit. And then we get down to his last paragraph here, where he mentions Peter Pan. He alludes to Peter Pan, the story of the boy who stays a boy, right? He's always a boy. And Scipio thinks that that's stupid. And therefore that Morosina and Renzo, the Conte, are also stupid. That being a child is stupid. This is what he's making a connection between Peter Pan, Morosina, the Conte, and being a child. He's connecting all of these things because of everything that's happened here, everything that happened up here, right? Everything that's carried through the whole story so far. And therefore, he's going to take a ride because he's done with childhood. And I love the final hits here. I want to be grown up, grown up, grown up. You can almost see him stamping his foot when he says that. I mean, like, grown up, grown up, grown up, which feels very childish, right? This would be something that maybe a little kid would do when they don't get their way, that they're throwing a little tantrum and stamping their foot and shouting the same idea. So there's a little bit of irony going on here, right? That's like, no, little irony of acting like a child while demanding to be an adult. Okay, which comes back to that original theme, right? All the way back up to here. This whole section kind of touches on it in different ways. We get Scipio's opinion of adulthood versus childhood. We even get to kind of hear his father's opinion, right? Through Scipio's biased perspective. But we see Morosina and the Conte's view. Obviously, they became children again, so they have, you know, that certain opinion about it. And then we've also delved into like Morosina's view of wealth and privilege, right? So there's a lot happening across this page. So that is just like kind of one way, another example of annotating. And, you know, we could go in deeper annotation wise to that passage. Can even talk about, like I was touching on, all those questions being accusatory. That also might even get a little bit into the writer's style and writer choices of how you express tone in writing. Right, so that's always, you know, another just sort of good layer to the conversation that you can be having about these things. So I'm going to change gears and kind of actually jump all the way to, so that was right in the middle of chapter 43. I'm going to jump all the way to the end of the book. And there's a lot of stuff that happens in between, but for the sake of kind of this final conversation, one of the things I like to do in the last few chapters, and as kind of the final things that each character goes through, as each of that happens, it's neat to look back at the whole story and kind of chart how the character has changed from beginning to end. So remember, we're approaching, or at least how I've been approaching this story, is completely from a character-driven perspective. So you can't get to the end and not talk about character, right? That's the whole railroad we've been riding this entire time. And character change, or lack of character change, is a huge piece of discussing character. And we've talked about it in pieces as things have happened like as the relationship between Prosper and Scipio changed a little bit. And then here it kind of changes again. So I want to go back to one of the things I talked about last week was the different kind of types of character we can have. So you have round versus flat, or static versus dynamic. And I had created a nice little like axis chart. There's an example of it. This is actually the copy of what I did with my student 3 days ago, maybe, not very long ago. He just finished this book. So we created, and I'm going to talk through all of these as I go. We created this chart, and we even defined each of the words down below so that he had their definitions. And then I had him pick characters, and he chose them. Like, okay, who are our main characters? Who else do you want to talk about? Who else have we been talking about? And let's decide where they go on this chart. So I did this a little bit last week with like 3 of the characters and kind of a quick little like example of this, but I want to go into it a little bit more because there's 2 great pieces of writing that I like to do with this. One is the chart that is really little pieces because you're writing just character names, but has a lot of great discussion buried around it. But it can sometimes be very difficult to decide where a character goes. When you look at the finished product that I have, this does not show you the 40 minutes we spent working on it, right? Or the, hours of sessions we've had leading up to be able to then have that conversation, right? You don't actually see the time involved. So I want to kind of explain that too, that it's not just like, oh, I magically know that Scipio is a round character and he's dynamic. I'm going to put him right there. That was easy, right? It's not always that simple. There can be a lot of kind of time and debate around it. And it is that time and debate that makes it worthwhile and makes stuff more memorable, makes stuff more usable. So I'm going to do this example with a couple of these characters. So I have my chart here. And like I said, this is already filled out, but I can walk you through some of kind of what my student was thinking and what we talked about with this. But what I like to do before that is I have a chart, and I made a nice organized one because I like being organized in charts. But honestly, if I were doing this with a student kind of in the middle of our conversation, I would just draw this on a piece of paper. But we have the beginning, and we have the end of the story. So near the beginning or at the beginning versus near or at the end of the story. And then we go through each character. So I'm going to start with Scipio because I feel like he is sometimes easier for students to see changes that happen. And so we put in each of these boxes how the character is or what they're like or the kind of person they are at the beginning versus at the end. So at the beginning, Scipio is the thief lord. Right? And what does that mean for him, right? Well, he lies, right? He is a liar, even if we don't know that at the very beginning. We know it now, looking back. He is arrogant. He wants to be in charge, right? That's a big thing about him. And my students will also sometimes include, especially in the case of Scipio, something a little more physical about him, that at the beginning of the story, he is a child, right? He's a teenager, but he's a kid. And we talk about the fact that he might be a child physically, but also kind of maturity-wise, right? Emotionally, he has very childish reactions to things, right? I think about him stamping his foot, screaming, "Grown up, grown up." I know that's not at the beginning of the book, but a good example of kind of childish behavior, childlike behavior. And then we go to the end. So by the end of the book, he is no longer the thief lord. He actually becomes a detective. He's not a liar anymore, right? Well, sort of. That one's a little more complicated. We'll get back to that. And I kind of go through these, like, do you think he is still arrogant and maybe, you know, self-centered? It's like, well, maybe in some ways, but maybe less. You know, and some of the answers, sometimes it's very clear. Like, no, he is no longer arrogant. And we can write, you know, he is now selfless. Sometimes it's a little more like, maybe he's less arrogant. Maybe he's less self-centered, a little bit more selfless, right? So it's okay to have unclear responses, right? I am going to zoom in, sorry. Does he need to be in charge anymore? Well, it's kind of an interesting one because it's tied to this one. He is no longer a child. Physically, he's an adult now, right? Because he rode the merry-go-round. And so his need to be in charge, his need to push back against the adults in his life is now gone, right? He's kind of now has to be in charge of himself. So perhaps, you know, maybe he's more independent in that way. It's kind of this back and forth. So we then look at this change and we have our chart off to the side here. And we decide, did he change? And yes, we do have a physical change going on, but mostly we're looking for emotional changes, maturity changes, growth as a person. We decide, yep, Scipio has changed. So he's definitely dynamic, right? So he would go in this, on this side of stuff. And we decide if he's round or flat, if he's kind of multi-sided, if he feels like a real person, which we agreed he did. So he would go in this round dynamic area. And then we move on to our next character. And we could do this through every single character that we have in the book, right? You could list everybody. I'm not going to go through everybody right now, but you certainly can. I want to move to Prosper next, especially because having just done this with my student, he struggled with Prosper because, as I've said previously, he's more subtle. Prosper's a more subtle character. And so at the beginning of the book, he really takes care of Beau. That's kind of his prime directive, is to take care of Beau. He is very cautious, right? We talk about that. He doesn't want to steal. He doesn't want to get caught. He wants to stay safe. You know, he's not always running out on these, you know, dangerous missions or making, you know, rash decisions. He's a very cautious person. And this is what's tough about him, is he has a certain maturity, right? Because of that, because he has to be in charge of Beau, because he's aware of the pressure as this, you know, as a caretaker, as the person who has to provide safety, as the one who's responsible for them running away in the first place, right? He feels a lot of that pressure and therefore has kind of a certain maturity that goes along with that. And he's not really able to have a childhood in the same way that like Beau is able to have. And by the end of the book, he is still cautious. He is still mature, right? He hasn't suddenly gone back in time and had a childhood, but there is a little bit of a shift that he realizes that he's not the only one who has to take care of Beau anymore, right? And that he himself can be taken care of. That he can kind of seek help from others and be rolled into kind of how others can be a part of this family, right? That he can have a family that isn't some crazy aunt who, you know, doesn't actually care about him, right? That he can be a part of this. And perhaps because of that, he has matured more. we could make an argument for that. And then kind of going along with cautious, but he also now really deeply understands consequences, right? This sort of this thing that has been happening throughout the story is that he understands the consequences of their actions, both good and bad, right? That if he understands why he should not get on the merry-go-round. But he also understands, from a good perspective, why he should stay with Ida Spavento and why Victor is actually an ally. So good and bad consequences that he really starts to understand. So my student and I, with this, had a real debate. We both agreed that Prosper was round. There's no doubt about it. We were 100% on that side. But my student could not decide if he really changed or not. It's like he really feels like he's the same person. And so we agreed, and I was pointing out some of the dynamic aspects of him, and he was kind of accepting them, but we agreed we're going to put him in this middle area. That maybe he's changed some, but it's not as obvious. So we're going to put him right in the middle, which is fine, right? Because it is hard to see that shift. So kind of making that allowance, I think, is totally fine, right? Nothing is always clear cut, right? Everything isn't always clear cut. So we would continue through all of our characters. I want to jump to one that I want to show, which is Barbarossa, because I always come back to him because I just love him. And I love what happens to him. He gets his comeuppance and it's perfect. But at the beginning of the book, and this is a pretty easy one for students too, if we describe Barbarossa, he is greedy, he is selfish, he takes advantage of people. And then I say, what kind of person is he at the very end of the book? And I love the last paragraph of the book is dedicated to Barbarossa, and it's perfect because it shows that he is greedy, he is selfish, and he takes advantage of people. He has not changed. He 100% equals the exact same person that he was at the beginning, even though he undergoes a very large physical change. But because we're talking in this emotional, more, what's the word I want? Growth area, like these internal changes, right? He remains the same person. And so we decided that he is static because of that. And we decided he's pretty unidimensional. What you see is what you get. He's got nothing to hide, right? So he is static and flat and a bad guy, right? He's our antagonist or one of our antagonists kind of throughout the story. So I would do that with every character, and we did. We talked about every single character and decided where they went and decided why. And I don't always agree with them, right? I don't actually agree with that my student put Bo up here. I think Bo goes somewhere else. But he had good reasons behind it, right? And again, we had that kind of debate about Prosper, but he had good reasons for one argument. I had, reasons for another argument, and we kind of met in the middle. But the thing I like to show after doing this, because he even said after we're working on this, and he goes, there's nobody who's dynamic and flat. I said, yeah, that's a really good point. And why not? And we think about the combination of the kinds of people we can have, or the kinds of characters we can have, is if you're flat, if you're one-sided, and that's just all there is, you're kind of a stereotype is our word, a nice word for that one. Would you make a lot of emotional or growth-based internal changes? And we decided it would be very difficult to actually be this kind of person, to be unidimensional, to be stereotypical, and to make like big kind of internal changes. And so you don't end up with characters down here very often. They can happen. You certainly could decide that a person fits that description. because there are no, hard and fast, you will never have a character down here, right? That's not going to be true. You might decide that somebody does belong here. But typically, we kind of end up with groupings in this category and groupings in this category. And I like to point out to my students as well that these are our main characters. And these are our minor characters. And again, Barbarossa, you could argue, is maybe a little bit more of a main character, but not as much as these. And this is what happens in writing. Here we're coming from this perspective of pure character. We can actually broaden to a perspective of general writing practices, right? Character building across the board. Pick a movie, pick a book, right? This is sort of the general pattern that you see, is that our main characters feel the most real. That's what makes them primary characters or main characters, that they are rounded, they have depth, they have complexity, they're fully developed, and they're undergoing some kind of journey, some kind of change. They're realizing things about the world. That's why we identify with them, right? That's why we identify with Scipio. Oh, you've lied about things, you felt betrayed by things, you've been unhappy in situations, and sometimes you're able to fix it and sometimes you're not, and maybe you learned something from it, right? That's why we can identify with Prosper in that same way. You feel like you need to take care of someone, but have you ever been taken, someone takes care of you in your life? So we really identify very strongly with this category because it is the most like real life. We do sometimes go over here a little bit, where you have a character who feels like a real person, very round and complex, but doesn't necessarily change. And then you get these more kind of just flashes, like photographs of a person, right? Rather than a fully realized, instead it's sort of a concept or an idea, right? Here's what you need to know about them. They help fill the cast. They help add interest. They help us, see a whole set world a little bit more. But mentally and emotionally, we can't attach to every single character that we have. That would just be ridiculous. That would be so much, right, as readers or as viewers of something. And so we have to have kind of background characters. And this is one of the ways in which characters become background, is they're flat and they're static. So I like the zoomed out way to then talk about whole text or whole story, right? Coming from this very, very specific view, right? That is sometimes the best way to get to those zoomed out perspectives, is actually entering it very, very particularly, right? Very closely. We've entered it over the shoulder of all of our characters. And that allows us to zoom out to these bigger ideas and bigger understanding. There's a lot of stuff. And even with those minor characters, I would still do that beginning and ending. Even if you know that they're minor characters, I would still do a little bit of that writing about beginning and ending, because it can help students realize kind of this difference between main characters and minor characters, or foreground and background characters. And maybe why, there's not as much screen time or page time dedicated to like Mosca. And it's like, I kind of want to know more about him. But he's a background character for this story. So again, can lead to kind of cool creativity, kind of, especially if you have a student who actually likes creative writing too, who likes, like, defines themselves as like, oh, I like to write, I want to create my own story. Well, this is a cool tool then to also use. Like, maybe you have a couple major, a couple minor characters, a couple, primary and secondary characters, and here's how you can do that. Right? Here's a doorway that can help you enter that world of creative writing, which is just kind of an added bonus, always a good time. Okay, so I have kind of just some wrap up ideas. I wanted to touch back on the fact that this book is very, very rich, which means that you can analyze it from a variety of perspectives. because there's a lot to dig through. There's a lot to look at. There's a lot to talk about, write about, all that good stuff. You can analyze it through a plot perspective, right? Stuff like that we talk about in Annotating Literary Elements, stuff that Rita talked about in her deep dive Crispin Facebook series, was a little bit more of this kind of plot analysis perspective. And you know, there are, I don't know, other entry points that you can use. You can talk about setting, right, as a way to enter analyzing a book, which I did actually briefly. I did use setting a little bit. But my primary focus again was character, because it can then lead you down these other paths. It can lead you to plot analysis. It can lead you to deeper understanding, deeper comprehension. It can lead you to theme. It can lead you to understand conflict, to understand setting and its role in a story, right? So even a specific sounding way to enter a book can open into other ways of understanding and analyzing. So it's kind of a, like, don't be afraid to use a specific entry point, right? Not everything has to come from this, you know, very high up, like, we're going to just analyze the book. It's like, great. How do you do that? Right? And you do it from these specific entry points. That was kind of that one thing I wanted to come back to. I also wanted to point out another character. So Annotating Literary Elements, we have that is a good plot analysis device, but you can also layer on Explore a Story as a great character analysis device into anything we were doing here, right? If you're like, oh, I want that extra piece. My child loves to draw, loves some art. That's a great, just sort of, we're going to do this with a character or two, right? Maybe better understand some of our more complicated characters, some of the more difficult ones. Okay, so it feels weird to like be wrapping up after being really deeply involved in a story for 4 weeks. It feels like, no, we'll just get on next week and keep talking about it. I have the same problem with my students that when we wrap up with a book and we're done with it, and we've done all our final writing and our final talking, and then it's like, okay, great, now what? Right? It feels like kind of a letdown. Linda, you asked a really good question about how many of these kind of deep dive or like literature analysis things is reasonable to do in a school year. Is a really good question, but of course always has a complex answer because nothing has a simple answer. I think it depends on the student, number one, and how much they can handle. In general, and you know, Rita may have a slightly different variation on this answer, as Maura might as well, as Tracy might as well, but I like to let the student kind of, we drive the pace together. Now, of course, I see students, you know, one-on-one for an hour a week, but we might cover like 2 chapters a week or 1 chapter a week or whatever it might be. And so with a longer book, it's going to take us longer. A shorter book might take us a shorter amount of time. So that does then change. Like, you know, if a book takes 4 months to read, it takes 4 months to read. You know, if we're done with it in a couple weeks, we're done with it in a couple weeks. I like to vary when I go super, super deep with when I do more of surface stuff. I like to kind of bounce back and forth. I also bounce back and forth with difficulty of text a little bit too. So if we just put a ton of effort into a big deep dive, we might have something that's a little more fun, a little more entertaining. We're still doing some of this work, but maybe not as much. And then we'll switch and do a heavier one following that. So that didn't answer your question directly at all, but because I don't think there's a set like do 3 books. Like I don't think that is helpful because it's not specific to the situation you're in. But I think kind of picking that pace that works, that gives you the space to dive deeply into something, but also not be so slowed down that you're not holding the plot of the book together anymore. It's an interesting, you got to find it, but yeah, I tend to do that kind of flip-flopping between heavy dives and then more surfacey stuff, but always still practicing good analysis skills, writing skills, whatever, whatever our goals are that we're working toward. So I hope that helped. Okay, so we are finished with The Thief Lord, finished talking about it. I hope that you liked it. I hope that you can go out, get the book, have a really good time, have great discussions with it, have great writing with it. It's definitely book club worthy, right? Get multiple kids involved, right? If they're all at that good, that reading and writing level that would support it. It's fun, have fun with it. That's my number one. You should enjoy the reading, writing, and analyzing process. It is work, it is practice that you have to do to get better at, but it should be fun. And I always have fun with this book, and I make sure my students have fun with it too.